My name is Maya Sterling. I am 32 years old. 2 months ago, I sat in a county courthouse and watched my ex-husband laugh in my face. He was wearing a $4,000 custom suit, paid for by the woman he left me for. He walked down the center aisle of the public foreclosure auction, leaned over my row, and told me I would always settle for garbage. He said it loud enough for the entire room of investors to hear. I did not yell. I did not cry. I just held the stamped deed to the abandoned house I had just bought for $200. What Trent did not know was that the garbage I just bought contained a hidden biometric steel vault, and behind that steel was $3.5 million in cash that his new billionaire father-in-law had stolen from my dead father's pension fund. When the federal tactical team finally breached my front door at 2 a.m, Trent was screaming from inside that very same vault. But I am getting ahead of myself. Welcome back to Luke Vengeance, where we tell real stories about absolute betrayal and the cold, hard math of getting even. If you have ever had someone look down on you because you played by the rules while they cheated, drop your age in the comments below. Hit subscribe because the trap I set for my ex-husband is something you are going to want to hear. Now let us get into it. I make my living as a municipal tax auditor in Southern California. My job is simple, but universally hated. I find the numbers people try to hide. While other people look at a property and see curb appeal, I look at it and see liabilities, tax liens, and leverage. If you read the local news, you probably saw the viral story about a lucky woman who bought a coastal property for $200 because of a county clerical glitch. That is a myth for amateurs. The system does not glitch. It gets manipulated. I did not buy that 1920s bungalow by accident. I bought it because I wrote a forensic algorithm designed to track irregularities in the automated registry. For weeks, I had watched a dummy shell corporation quietly manipulate the foreclosure listings. They were attempting to wash the title of a specific abandoned property by burying it deep in the system and buying it back for pennies. It is a classic laundering move. I did not report them. I just adjusted my algorithm. I sniped the property for exactly $200, just 4 milliseconds before their automated system could lock the bid. When the auctioneer slammed his gavel and called my paddle number, the room went dead silent. And then Trent laughed. We had been divorced for 14 months. Trent was a flashy residential developer who built mansions that looked like modern art museums but fell apart just as fast. He had left me for Elise Pierce, the daughter of his primary investor, a ruthless billionaire developer named Julian Pierce. Trent traded my civil servant salary for a limitless black card and a new life. He stood up from the front row, walked over to my seat, and stopped. He smelled like expensive bergamot cologne and unearned confidence. $200, Maya. Trent sneered, looking me up and down. You know that lot is flagged for toxic soil runoff, right? The remediation alone will bankrupt you in a month. He laughed again, a harsh, pitying sound. But I guess that makes sense. You always were comfortable settling for garbage. I looked at his manicured hands. I did not defend myself. Trent thought he knew everything because he knew how to spend his new father-in-law's money. But Trent did not read municipal soil reports. I did. I had pulled the 1928 geological surveys from the city archives the night before. I knew the property was not toxic. The runoff flag was a fabricated zoning code deliberately placed there by someone with high-level city access to scare away independent buyers. Someone desperately wanted that house to remain empty and ignored. And Julian Pierce just happened to own the holding company that developed the adjacent neighborhoods. I walked out of the courthouse and drove straight to the property. It sat on a quiet, gentrifying street surrounded by overgrown oak trees. The paint was peeling, and the porch sagged under my weight. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air was stale, smelling of dry rot and decades of dust. I walked through the living room, down the narrow hallway, and stopped inside the master bedroom. I pulled out my laser measuring tape. I shot the red beam from the doorway to the far wall. 12 feet. I walked outside to the exterior of the house and measured the exact same wall from the outside. 16 feet. I walked back inside and stood in the dead silence of the abandoned house. A house does not just lose 4 feet of depth between the exterior wood siding and the interior drywall. There was a 30-square-foot void hidden somewhere in this room. I set my bag down on the scuffed hardwood floor. I reached inside and pulled out a heavy steel crowbar. Trent thought I had bought toxic waste. He was wrong. I drove the curved end of the crowbar into the water-damaged plaster and pulled. Dust choked the air. I swung again, breaking through the wooden lath. But the crowbar did not punch through to the other side. It stopped with a violent, bone-jarring clang. It did not hit wood. It hit industrial-grade reinforced steel. I widened the hole, tearing away sheets of drywall with my bare hands. I uncovered a biometric vault door, seamlessly integrated into the concrete foundation of the house. This was not a residential wall safe. This was a bank-grade fortress. It took me 7 days, 3 rented angle grinders, and a dozen titanium blades to bypass the secondary hinges. The dread simmered with every spark that flew in the dark room. Someone had spent an absolute fortune hiding this space. Finally, on the 7th night, the heavy steel door groaned and swung outward. A rush of cold, climate-controlled air washed over my face. I raised my flashlight and stepped into the dark void. But as my foot crossed the threshold, the motion sensor security light I had installed in the driveway suddenly clicked on. Blinding white light spilled through the rotting window blinds. I froze. A black SUV with heavily tinted windows was idling silently directly in front of my porch. I held my breath. The idling engine of the black SUV vibrated through the floorboards beneath my boots. The blinding white security light cast long, distorted shadows across the peeling wallpaper of the master bedroom. I gripped the heavy steel crowbar in my right hand until my knuckles turned white. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I waited for the sound of car doors opening. I waited for armed men to kick down the rotting front door. In Southern California, when you uncover a hidden biometric vault, your mind immediately goes to the worst-case scenario. You think of cartel stash houses and violent men who do not leave witnesses. For 3 agonizing minutes, the vehicle just sat there. The heavy tint on the windows made it impossible to see who was inside. Then, slowly, the engine revved, and the SUV rolled forward, disappearing down the dark, gentrifying street. I exhaled a shaky breath. My hands were trembling so badly I almost dropped the flashlight. I turned my attention back to the open vault. The heavy steel door had swung outward, revealing a space the size of a large walk-in closet. The air inside was completely different from the rest of the house. It was crisp, climate-controlled, and smelled faintly of ozone and fresh ink. I stepped over the threshold and swept my flashlight across the interior. Floor-to-ceiling metal shelving lined the walls. Stacked meticulously on those shelves were vacuum-sealed bricks of currency. I count money for a living. I audit municipal budgets and property taxes. I know what volume looks like. I did the math in my head instantly. The bricks were composed entirely of $100 bills bound in tight plastic. There were roughly 35,000 individual bills in that room. $3.5 million in untraceable physical cash. I did not panic. When you spend your life dissecting complex spreadsheets, you learn to detach your emotions from raw numbers. But resting on the very center stack of currency was something that made my blood run cold. It was a heavy cream-colored envelope sealed with dark red wax. I set my flashlight down on a metal shelf and picked up the envelope. I broke the thick wax seal with my thumb. Inside was a single square of premium cardstock. Typed in the dead center in crisp black ink was one word: alibi. Sitting directly beneath the envelope was a thick black leather-bound ledger. I slipped the ledger into my canvas tote bag. My mind raced with desperate escape plans. If this was a narco stash house, my life was essentially over. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the dark corner of the living room, clutching the steel crowbar and listening to every creak and groan of the settling house. I did not sleep a single second. I waited for the cartel to return. The sun finally rose, casting pale morning light through the filthy windows. At exactly 8 in the morning, a sharp, confident knock echoed through the empty house. It was not the police. It was not a cartel hitman. I opened the heavy wooden door and found Julian Pierce standing on my sagging porch. Julian was Trent's new father-in-law and the most ruthless luxury real estate developer in the county. He was a billionaire who treated the city council like his own personal board of directors. Julian never visited active job sites. He operated exclusively from glass corner offices and private golf clubs. Yet here he was, standing on my rotting porch, wearing an immaculate navy cashmere overcoat and a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Good morning, Maya," he said smoothly. His voice was rich and practiced. "Trent told me about your little auction stunt. I admire the hustle, but let us be realistic here. This place is a total teardown. You are in way over your head." He reached into his tailored pocket and pulled out a certified bank check. "I am prepared to offer you $150,000 right now," he said, extending the paper toward me. "Take the win, Maya. Walk away and start fresh." It was a massive sum for a house I had bought for $200 just yesterday. Most people would have snatched the check and ran. But my eyes dropped to his shoes. He was wearing handmade Italian leather loafers. They were impeccably polished, except for one tiny, glaring detail. Lodged deep in the welt of his left shoe was a distinct speck of vintage white plaster dust. It was the exact proprietary blend of historical lath and plaster I had swept up outside the hidden vault just 12 hours ago. He had been the one sitting in the black SUV last night. The money in the vault did not belong to a violent cartel. It belonged to him. I looked back up at his cold, calculating eyes. I smiled politely and pushed the check back toward his chest. "Thank you for the generous offer, Julian," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even. "But I have a real passion for historical renovation. I think I will keep it." Julian's practiced smile vanished instantly. The charming father-in-law facade dropped, revealing the absolute predator underneath. He stepped 1 inch closer to me. "People who hold on to things they do not understand tend to get hurt, Maya," he warned softly. His tone was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of an anvil. He turned and walked down the cracked concrete steps to his waiting town car. I had just rejected a bribe from the most powerful man in the city, and he was about to unleash the entire weight of the municipal government upon me. Julian did not send street thugs with baseball bats. He sent the bureaucracy. He weaponized the system he controlled. The very next morning, a city code enforcement officer arrived unannounced at my property. He did not bother to inspect the interior wiring. He did not check the plumbing. He walked straight to the exterior foundation, snapped 2 quick photographs, and pulled out a book of citations. He stapled a bright red tag to my front door. "Catastrophic structural failure," he declared, handing me a clipboard. "You have exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises and surrender the property for municipal demolition." It was a targeted, fabricated strike designed to legally evict me so Julian's private crews could bulldoze the walls and extract the steel vault. I tried to argue, but my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an automated email from the auditing firm where I had worked for 6 years. The subject line read, "Administrative Review." The body of the email stated that my municipal contract was indefinitely suspended without pay, pending an anonymous ethics investigation. Julian was squeezing the air out of my lungs. He was executing a textbook isolation protocol. 10 minutes later, the house went entirely dark. The city water main was shut off at the street, and the power grid was severed under the guise of an emergency public safety ordinance. No electricity, no running water, no income, no legal right to occupy my own home. Julian wanted to starve me out. He assumed a woman with no money, no power, and no public support would simply break under the massive pressure. He thought stripping away my career and my reputation would force me to crawl back to him and beg for that check. But Julian Pierce made a massive miscalculation. He did not realize that by taking away my job and my professional obligations, he had just given me 24 hours a day to focus entirely on destroying him. When you remove a person's safety net, you also remove their fear of falling. I locked the front door from the inside. I walked back into the dark, freezing living room and set up a folding table. I sparked my camping lantern, bathing the room in a warm, amber glow. I pulled the thick black leather ledger out of my tote bag and opened it to the first page. I am an auditor. Numbers are my native language. I can trace a hidden asset through a dozen offshore shell companies faster than most people can balance a checkbook. I sat down in the cold, empty house and began to read. I was going to find out exactly what Julian Pierce was so desperate to bury. And then I was going to use his own math to bury him. But before I could decipher the final column of the ledger, another car pulled into my driveway. This time, it was not a city official. It was my own sister, and she had come to finish the job Julian started. I watched through the cracked front window of the dark living room as a silver Mercedes parked on the street outside. The driver's side door opened and my older sister, Elise, stepped onto the uneven pavement. Elise and I shared the exact same parents, but we lived in entirely different realities. While I spent my 20s studying complex tax law and building a stable civil service career, Elise chased status. She worshipped Trent and his lavish lifestyle, openly mocking my practical choices. When Trent left me for Julian Pierce's daughter, Elise did not cut ties with my cheating ex-husband. She actually started attending his private country club dinners. She preferred the illusion of wealth over the reality of loyalty. Elise knocked softly before pushing the front door open. She walked into the freezing house, stepping carefully in her designer heels to avoid the loose floorboards. She put her manicured hand over her nose, acting horrified by the thick dust and the solitary camping lantern I had set up on the folding table. She told me everyone was incredibly worried about my mental state. She used a fake, soothing voice, claiming I was experiencing a psychotic break because the divorce had finally broken my grip on reality. She reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a thick legal document. It was a medical power of attorney. Elise wanted me to sign away my legal autonomy. She promised that if I simply signed the paper, Julian would generously buy the house from me, and she would personally check me into a luxury private psychiatric facility to rest and recover. But I audit people for a living. I do not just listen to what people say. I watch exactly what they do. While Elise poured out fake sympathy, her eyes kept darting past my shoulder. She was staring intently down the dark, narrow hallway leading directly to the master bedroom. She was not here to check on my health. She was acting as a scout. She knew exactly what was hidden behind that plaster. Julian had offered her a massive payout to legally neutralize me without using force. I looked at her designer handbag and refused to sign the document. The moment I said no, the sisterly concern completely vanished. Elise dropped the sweet act, and her face hardened into a mask of pure resentment. She called me a bitter loser who always ruined everything for everyone else. She turned on her heel and stormed out, leaving a trail of expensive perfume lingering in the stale air. My own blood had sold me out for a seat at Julian's table. Now I knew exactly who the enemy was, and I knew I was completely alone. I locked the deadbolt, sat back down at the folding table, and opened Julian's black leather ledger. I spent the next 14 hours reading the numbers by the flickering amber light of the lantern. The handwritten entries were a masterclass in forensic obfuscation. Julian had mapped out a massive web of shell companies, limited liability corporations, and offshore wire transfers. He was inflating municipal development contracts, skimming the excess revenue, and funneling the money out of the country. But the final reconciliation column on the very last page hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The physical cash sitting inside my hidden vault was exactly $3.5 million. That number was not random. It matched the exact deficit missing from the county teachers' pension fund. It was the same municipal pension fund my late father had paid into for 40 years. I remembered the exact day the fund collapsed. My dad sat at our kitchen table, holding a letter from the county stating his retirement account had been restructured into nothing. He had worked his entire life to secure his future, and Julian Pierce stole it with a fountain pen. My father was forced to take a job working double shifts at a distribution warehouse just to pay his mortgage until his heart gave out on the concrete floor at 64 years old. Julian and Trent had not just stolen tax dollars, they had stolen my father's retirement. They were the reason he died exhausted and broken. The word alibi typed on that sealed cardstock was not a threat to me. It was the decryption password to the offshore accounts listed in the ledger. The cash in the vault was their untraceable emergency escape fund. The fear I had been carrying all day completely evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a cold, absolute clarity. This was no longer about defending a $200 real estate investment. This was about profound vengeance. Julian and Trent had destroyed my family using complex math. I was going to use that exact same math to execute them. I barely slept that night. The sun came up, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn outside. Furious that the city code enforcement intimidation tactic had failed, Trent decided to play his next card. He abandoned the bureaucratic approach and went straight for the legal jugular. At 9 a.m, a heavy commercial truck pulled into my driveway. Trent stepped out wearing a casual weekend sweater that probably cost more than my entire vehicle. But he was not alone. A man in a gray uniform carrying a heavy metal toolkit walked up the steps right behind him. It was a court-appointed locksmith. Trent held up a thick manila folder and smiled his dreaded, arrogant grin. He handed me an emergency asset freeze issued by the county family court. He claimed we had initiated the purchase of this exact property while we were still legally married. According to his paperwork, the house was community property and a judge had granted him immediate physical access to appraise his half of the asset. It was a brilliant, vicious lie. Trent knew the city could not legally demolish the house if an active family court dispute was on the record. He was using the divorce laws to force his way inside the building so he could access the vault and retrieve the stolen pension money. He turned to the locksmith and ordered him to start drilling the locks on the front door. He looked back at me and laughed, telling me I should have taken Julian's check while I had the chance. I did not yell. I did not try to physically block the door. I simply reached into my tote bag and pulled out a certified digital forensics affidavit. I had printed it weeks ago during my initial audit of his shell companies. I handed the paper directly to the locksmith. I calmly explained that the metadata on Trent's backdated community property document contained a fatal error. Trent had forged the paperwork using a digital notary stamp that had not been officially issued by the state until 6 months after our divorce was finalized. He had just presented a forged legal document in front of a licensed municipal contractor. Filing a fabricated document to manipulate family court is a serious felony in California. The locksmith read the affidavit carefully. He looked at the date of the notary stamp and then looked at Trent. He knew instantly that he was being used to commit a crime. Without saying a single word, the locksmith packed his heavy drills back into his metal toolbox, turned around, and walked straight back to his truck. He drove away, leaving Trent standing alone on the sagging porch. Trent's smug smile morphed into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. His face turned a deep shade of crimson. He lunged forward, grabbing the porch railing, his knuckles turning white with fury. His legal avenues were completely exhausted. The city could not evict me, and the courts could not grant him entry. He screamed that I was a dead woman walking and peeled out of the driveway, leaving black tire marks on the pavement. As I watched his expensive car disappear down the street, I knew the game had fundamentally changed. Trent had failed using the law. Julian had failed using the city bureaucracy. Elise had failed using psychological manipulation. They were completely out of clever tricks and legal loopholes. The next time they came back, they would not bring lawyers or clipboards. They would bring crowbars and heavy weapons. I walked back inside and stared down the dark hallway toward the master bedroom. I needed to empty that vault before nightfall because the physical breach was coming. I was going to make sure that when my ex-husband finally broke into this house, he walked straight into an inescapable trap. I watched Trent's expensive car disappear down the street, knowing the game had fundamentally changed. His legal avenues were completely exhausted. The city could not evict me, and the courts could not grant him entry. He screamed that I was a dead woman walking before peeling out of the driveway. He was coming back. And the next time he arrived, he would not bring a court-appointed locksmith. He would bring a crowbar and absolute malice. I walked back inside the dark, freezing house and stared down the narrow hallway toward the master bedroom. I needed to empty that biometric enclosure before nightfall because the physical breach was imminent. I was going to make sure that when my cheating ex-husband finally broke into this property, he walked straight into an inescapable nightmare. I stepped over the threshold of the massive steel room. The air inside was stagnant now that Julian had severed the municipal power grid. My camping lantern cast long, distorted shadows across the metal shelving units. I began pulling the vacuum-sealed bricks of currency down, one by one, stacking them into heavy canvas duffel bags. The physical weight of $3.5 million is staggering. It is heavy, dense, and smells like corporate greed. As I cleared the bottom shelf, my flashlight beam caught something strange about the floor paneling. I am an auditor. I spend my life looking for discrepancies in vast seas of information. I notice when things do not perfectly align. The concrete floor was solid everywhere except for a faint millimeter gap surrounding a 2-foot rectangular steel plate positioned directly in front of the back shelves. I knelt down and ran my fingertips along the cold seam. I pressed my entire body weight against the metal rectangle. It depressed slightly, yielding with a faint metallic click. I followed a series of hidden wires embedded in the corner joint of the wall. They connected directly upward into the primary locking mechanism of the heavy bank-grade door. My breath caught in my throat as the realization washed over me. It was a pressure-sensitive weight plate, a secondary fail-safe mechanism. Julian Pierce did not build things without brutal contingencies. If unauthorized weight shifted on that specific floor panel while the exterior biometric scanner was disengaged, it triggered an automated mechanical deadbolt. It would slam the heavy door permanently shut from the outside, locking whoever was inside in a soundproof tomb. Julian had built a literal panic room that doubled as a lethal steel trap for ambitious thieves. I did not attempt to disable the wiring. I weaponized it. I spent the next 6 grueling hours relocating all 35,000 individual $100 bills. My hands blistered and my muscles ached, but I carried the heavy duffel bags into the living room. I used my pry bar to pull up the original hardwood floorboards in the center of the room. I packed the vacuum-sealed currency tightly into the deep structural joists, spreading the bricks out meticulously so the floor would not bulge or squeak. I nailed the aged wood back into place and covered the area with a faded woven rug. The stolen pension fund was now completely invisible. I walked back into the master bedroom. The steel enclosure was entirely empty. I used a flathead screwdriver to recalibrate the pressure plate mechanism, adjusting the tension spring to make it hypersensitive. A stray breath could trigger it now. I positioned 3 battery-powered hidden cellular cameras. I placed one in the narrow hallway, one in the living room, and one directly facing the open door of the trap. I packed my laptop, my lantern, and Julian's black ledger into my tote bag. I walked out of the freezing house, locking the deadbolt behind me. I walked 3 blocks down the street and climbed into my nondescript sedan parked deep in the shadows of a massive, overgrown oak tree. I cracked the window to let the crisp night air circulate and opened my laptop. I pulled up the live infrared camera feeds. The house looked like a dark, hollow shell on the glowing screen. I sat in the absolute silence, drinking cold black coffee from a thermos, waiting for the mouse to take the cheese. Time stretched into the early hours of the morning. The neighborhood was dead quiet. Then, at exactly 1:15, my phone buzzed violently against the dashboard. Motion detected in the basement. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my pulse accelerating. A bright thermal heat signature squeezed through the narrow ground-level window on the side of the house. It was Trent. He was wearing dark tactical clothing and carrying a heavy, empty canvas duffel bag strapped across his chest. In his right hand, he held a suppressed firearm. The sight of the weapon sent a sharp spike of adrenaline through my chest. My ex-husband had come to kill me over money he did not even earn. As I watched Trent carefully navigate the dark basement stairs, a chilling epiphany washed over my mind. Julian Pierce was a billionaire with infinite resources and deep connections to the criminal underworld. He could have easily sent a dozen heavily armed professional mercenaries to secure his stolen $3.5 million. Instead, he sent his arrogant, incompetent son-in-law entirely alone in the middle of the night. Why would a ruthless mastermind do that? Because Julian knew about the secondary failsafe. He knew the pressure plate was active. Trent clearly did not. Trent was not a trusted business partner. Trent was expendable bait. Julian was hoping Trent would enter the enclosure, grab the cash, trigger the floor trap, and get permanently locked inside. When the federal authorities eventually found the missing pension money and the trapped man, Julian would simply frame his own son-in-law as the lone rogue embezzler. Julian would walk away completely clean, retaining his empire, while Trent took the entire fall and went to federal prison. Trent had traded my loyalty for a family that viewed him as completely disposable collateral. The dramatic irony was almost beautiful. On the laptop screen, Trent crept down the main hallway. His thermal outline paused, listening for any movement. Believing the house was empty, he reached the master bedroom. He saw the open, heavy steel door. He lowered his suppressed weapon and eagerly stepped inside the dark space, raising a small tactical flashlight. I held my breath, watching his glowing outline approach the back shelving. He took one final step forward. He planted his boots squarely onto the hidden pressure plate. Even from 3 blocks away, sitting inside my sealed car, I heard the deafening mechanical clang echo through the quiet neighborhood. The massive industrial door slammed shut with bone-crushing force. The 4-inch titanium deadbolt slid deep into the concrete foundation. The lock engaged permanently. Trent dropped his flashlight. I watched the infrared camera feed as he frantically slammed his fists against the immovable steel barrier. He was screaming into a soundproof void with 0 cellular service. He was buried alive inside a coffin engineered by the very man he thought was his mentor. A wave of profound satisfaction washed over me. The math was perfectly balanced. Trent was finally facing the exact consequences of his own arrogance. But before I could even process the victory, my perimeter cameras pinged a second time. The green motion sensor light on my dashboard flashed rapidly. Trent was neutralized, but Julian Pierce was a man of multiple contingencies. The streetlights outside my car suddenly flickered and died. The entire neighborhood was plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. Julian had used his high-level municipal influence to intentionally sever the local power grid. Rolling slowly down the dark street, creeping toward my front porch, were 3 unmarked black tactical vans. The real assault was just beginning. I watched through the windshield of my hidden sedan as the heavy tactical vehicles shifted into park. The true nature of Julian Pierce was finally on full display. He did not operate within the boundaries of the law. He operated above it. When bureaucratic intimidation and legal loopholes failed, he simply purchased brute force and cloaked it in absolute darkness. 15 men stepped out of the unmarked vans. They wore matching black tactical gear, but carried no official law enforcement insignia. They were private military contractors, highly paid mercenaries brought in to do the dirty work of a desperate billionaire. They pulled heavy demolition saws, sledgehammers, and thick steel pry bars from the rear compartments of their vehicles. Julian emerged from the lead vehicle wearing the same immaculate cashmere overcoat he had worn on my front porch. He was orchestrating an illegal home invasion and structural demolition under the convenient cover of a municipal blackout he had intentionally caused. This was the systemic squeeze in its purest physical form. He believed that whoever held the most power and the most money dictated the outcome of reality. I sat in the cold driver's seat of my car. My heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm. I did not feel fear. I felt the profound calm of an auditor who has just balanced an impossible ledger. I opened my laptop computer and accessed my encrypted cloud server. I had spent hours preparing a comprehensive digital dossier. It contained high-resolution forensic scans of the black leather book I had retrieved from the hidden room. It highlighted every single routing number for the offshore shell companies. It provided the exact decryption password, alibi. Most importantly, it contained the precise geographic coordinates of the stolen $3.5 million, mapping directly to the floorboards of my living room. I carefully selected the recipient list. I added the state attorney general. I added the regional director of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I added the senior editors of 3 major investigative journalism outlets. I took a deep, crisp breath of night air and pressed the enter key. The massive data package fired instantly through the encrypted cellular network. The clock was no longer ticking for me. The hourglass had just flipped for the corrupt developer. I closed the laptop and slipped out of my vehicle. The street was completely devoid of ambient light. I stuck to the deep shadows cast by the overgrown oak trees creeping silently toward the edge of my property. The private contractors were entirely focused on the front entrance of the house. I watched as 4 men swung a massive steel battering ram into my front door. The heavy wood splintered with a deafening crack that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. The mercenaries poured into the dark hallway, sweeping the interior with high-powered tactical flashlights. I used the distraction to slip around the perimeter of the building. I approached the same narrow basement window Trent had used to infiltrate the structure earlier that night. I slid feet first into the dark, damp, subterranean level of the house, dropping quietly onto the packed dirt floor. The air down here smelled of ancient earth and settling dust. Directly above my head, heavy tactical boots stomped across the original hardwood floorboards. They were marching directly over the 35,000 individual $100 bills I had meticulously hidden in the structural joists. The mercenaries swept through the living room and headed down the narrow hallway toward the master bedroom. I listened intently as they discovered the heavy biometric enclosure. Muffled shouts filtered down through the floorboards. I heard the unmistakable voice of Julian Pierce enter the house. One of the contractors yelled that the massive steel door was permanently locked and someone was trapped inside. Julian marched down the hallway. He realized instantly that his own son-in-law was the man screaming from the soundproof void. But the billionaire developer did not issue an order for a rescue operation. His voice echoed down the ventilation shafts, cold, ruthless, and entirely calculating. Julian ordered the men to ignore the trapped man. He commanded them to fire up the heavy concrete saws and tear the entire structure apart to extract the cash. Trent was completely disposable to him. Sitting inside that dark steel coffin, Trent was listening to the man he idolized abandon him for dead. The betrayal Trent had inflicted upon me was now being inflicted upon him by his chosen family. I crouched in the absolute darkness of the basement. I stood directly next to the primary municipal water line. When I purchased this forgotten property, I had memorized the historical geological surveys. I knew this specific parcel of land sat directly on top of a highly pressurized, volatile underground water table. The original foundation expansion joints were engineered specifically to manage massive hydrostatic pressure. Julian had brought expensive, heavy machinery and absolute brute force. I had brought historical blueprints and elementary physics. I raised my heavy steel crowbar in the dark. I aimed directly for the rusted iron coupling of the main irrigation valve protruding from the concrete wall. I tightened my grip and swung the heavy metal tool with every ounce of physical strength in my shoulders. The thick iron pipe shattered upon impact. 80 pounds per square inch of pressurized municipal water violently exploded into the confined basement space. The roar of the rushing liquid was instantly deafening. The massive volume of water immediately mixed with the dry, volatile dirt floor. Within seconds, the subterranean level transformed into a churning vortex of thick, viscous mud. The foundation acted exactly like a loaded spring, finally releasing its pent-up energy. The water level rose with terrifying speed, surging upward toward the wooden floor joists. I scrambled up the concrete wall, grabbing the edge of the narrow window frame. I pulled my body through the opening and tumbled out onto the damp exterior grass, just as the freezing mud lapped at my heavy boots. I rolled onto my back and listened to the beautiful chaos unfolding inside the structure. The surging water breached the main floorboards. The contractors were desperately attempting to spark their heavy, gas-powered demolition saws and industrial electrical equipment. The rising liquid flooded their expensive tools, instantly short-circuiting the massive machines. Bright blue sparks flew in the dark hallway, followed by the smell of burning ozone. Heavy tactical boots slipped and slid against the rapidly accumulating mud. The highly paid mercenaries dropped their useless equipment. Absolute panic erupted among the professionals. They could not cut through the steel vault, and they could not maintain their physical footing. The house itself was actively fighting back against the invasion, swallowing them in an inescapable swamp. I stood up and brushed the wet dirt from my jeans. I walked calmly toward the front of the property, remaining just outside the reach of their flashlights. Julian Pierce was standing on the sagging front porch. His immaculate, handmade Italian loafers were rapidly sinking into the muddy water, now spilling over the wooden threshold. He was screaming frantic orders into the dark house, completely losing his pristine corporate composure. He demanded his men find the cash immediately. He looked absolutely pathetic. The untouchable billionaire was throwing a desperate temper tantrum in the middle of a muddy disaster zone. He suddenly noticed me standing on the edge of the dark lawn, his eyes locked onto mine, filled with pure, unadulterated hatred. He pointed a trembling, muddy finger in my direction, opening his mouth to issue a final, devastating threat. But the words never left his throat. A blinding flash of intense red and blue light suddenly reflected off his expensive cashmere overcoat. The shrill, piercing wail of multiple police sirens shattered the neighborhood's silence. Heavy armored federal vehicles turned aggressively onto the narrow street, completely blocking the escape routes of the unmarked tactical vans. The authorities had received my digital dossier. The Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division, backed by heavily armed state police officers, swarmed the front lawn with weapons drawn. The federal agents did not care about local code enforcement violations or municipal red tags. They cared exclusively about federal tax fraud, massive embezzlement, and stolen government pension funds. The ultimate predator of the county had just been cornered by a much larger, much hungrier apex predator. I simply stood in the quiet shadows, crossed my arms over my chest, and watched the arrogant empire completely fall apart. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles cut through the darkness of the neighborhood, casting chaotic, colorful shadows across the muddy, overgrown lawn. The untouchable billionaire Julian Pierce was standing in ankle-deep sludge, surrounded by heavily armed state police officers. His pristine cashmere overcoat was stained with thick, wet dirt. His highly paid private military contractors were currently face down in the mud, with their hands secured behind their backs. The tactical raid was unfolding exactly as my forensic algorithm and my dead man switch had predicted. I stood near the edge of the property line, holding the heavy black leather ledger in my hands. The lead agent of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division was walking directly toward me. He asked me to confirm my identity and provide the physical evidence corroborating my digital dossier. But before I could fully hand over the ledger and explain the offshore routing numbers, a silver Mercedes screeched to a halt right at the edge of the police barricade. The driver's side door flew open. It was my sister, Elise. She had always worshipped the lavish lifestyle that Trent and Julian represented, openly mocking my civil servant salary and my practical choices. Now she ducked under the yellow police tape and ran across the wet grass, feigning a look of profound, tearful concern. Her expensive designer heels sank into the mud, but she did not seem to care. She threw her arms around me in a desperate, dramatic embrace that felt entirely hollow. "Maya, everyone is so incredibly worried about you," Elise cried out, making sure her voice carried loud enough for the federal agents to hear. She turned her tear-streaked face toward the lead investigator. She did not bring a sledgehammer or a tactical weapon to stop me. Her weapon was far more insidious. Elise stepped between me and the investigator, claiming that my recent isolation and my supposed delusions about the abandoned house were textbook signs of a severe mental breakdown. She told the federal agent that the trauma of my divorce had completely fractured my grip on reality. She insisted that there was no stolen pension fund and no grand conspiracy. According to my own flesh and blood, I was simply a bitter, unstable ex-wife hallucinating a crime to punish the man who left me. She reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a thick, legally binding document. It was a medical power of attorney. "Officer, please, you have to understand my sister is deeply unwell," Elise cooed, projecting the perfect image of a heartbroken sibling. "Just let her sign this document. Let me manage her legal affairs and get her the psychiatric help she desperately needs. Julian was just trying to buy this toxic property to help our family." It was a master class in psychological warfare. She was actively trying to gaslight me into signing away my legal autonomy right in front of federal law enforcement. If I was officially deemed mentally incompetent by my own family member, my credibility as a whistleblower would be completely destroyed. The physical ledger in my hands would be dismissed as the obsessive scribblings of a delusional woman. Julian and his expensive lawyers would use the medical power of attorney to suppress the evidence, sweep the home invasion under the rug, and walk away entirely clean. But I audit people for a living. I am trained to ignore the emotional performance and focus entirely on the micro-expressions. While Elise poured out her fake sympathy, her eyes were frantically scanning the dark hallway of the flooded house behind me. She was looking toward the master bedroom. She knew exactly what was hidden behind that steel door. Julian had promised her a massive payout to legally neutralize me if his physical intimidation tactics failed. I looked at the medical power of attorney trembling in her manicured hands. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply looked at the federal agent and then looked back at my sister. I absolutely refused to sign the paper. The moment the word "no" left my lips, her faux sympathy evaporated instantly. The mask slipped, dropping to the muddy ground. Her features hardened into a cold, calculating glare, filled with absolute venom. "You always ruin everything for everyone," Elise hissed, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper meant only for my ears. She shoved the legal document back into her designer bag and stormed away from me. She had made her choice. She had chosen Julian's hush money and the illusion of high society over her own blood. Now I knew exactly who the true enemy was, and the most painful realization was that the deepest betrayal lived right inside my own family tree. I turned my back on my sister and handed the black leather ledger directly to the lead federal investigator. I calmly explained the complex money laundering scheme. I showed him the exact offshore limited liability corporations. I provided the decryption password alibi, which linked Julian Pierce directly to the stolen county teachers' pension funds. The investigator flipped through the handwritten pages, his expression hardening as he recognized the sheer scale of the municipal corruption. He signaled to his tactical team to officially take Julian into federal custody. But the chaotic night was far from over. While the agents were securing the perimeter, another squad of officers waded into the flooded basement of the house. They navigated the thick, churning mud and the short-circuited demolition equipment left behind by the mercenaries. They reached the master bedroom and discovered the massive biometric vault door. Because the secondary pressure plate failsafe had permanently locked the titanium deadbolt, the agents had to deploy a heavy thermal breaching torch to cut through the industrial steel hinges. White-hot sparks showered the dark hallway as the federal team slowly dismantled the impregnable fortress. Finally, with a deafening groan of tortured metal, the heavy vault door was pried open. Trent was dragged out of the pitch-black, soundproof void. My arrogant, flashy ex-husband was completely unrecognizable. He was covered in sweat and grime, shaking violently and weeping uncontrollably. He had spent hours trapped inside a dark steel coffin, fully believing he was going to suffocate to death, while his billionaire father-in-law demolished the house around him. The federal agents secured his wrists with heavy zip ties and hauled him out onto the front lawn, dragging him right past the spot where Julian Pierce was standing in handcuffs. The moment Trent saw Julian, the final remaining shred of their criminal alliance completely disintegrated. Trent stopped weeping and started screaming. He pointed his bound hands at the older man and frantically told the federal agents that Julian was the mastermind behind the entire operation. Trent confessed, right there on the wet grass, that Julian had forced him to manipulate the city zoning codes and hide the stolen pension money. The betrayal circle was now absolute. Trent had betrayed me, Julian had betrayed Trent, and now Trent was betraying Julian to save his own skin. It was a perfectly balanced equation of profound greed. But Julian Pierce was a man who refused to lose even when the handcuffs were already locked around his wrists. He watched his empire crumbling in the mud, and his eyes locked onto me with a desperate, predatory gleam. If he was going down, he was going to drag me into the abyss with him. Julian turned to the lead investigator and played his final, most dangerous card. He laughed a cold, bitter sound that cut through the noise of the police radios. He told the federal agent that Trent was a lying coward and that I was the actual criminal mastermind. Julian claimed that I was the one who had embezzled the $3.5 million from the county, using my high-level access as a municipal tax auditor. He stated that I had lured them to the abandoned property tonight to frame them for my own crimes. The investigator paused, looking between Julian Trent and me. Julian smiled a wicked, triumphant smile. He told the federal agent that if they truly wanted to find the missing pension funds, they should search the property immediately. Because according to Julian, the massive pile of stolen cash was actively sitting in my physical possession, making me the primary suspect of a federal crime. The lead investigator slowly turned his gaze toward me. His expression shifted from cooperative to highly suspicious. He placed his hand resting on his utility belt and asked me a single, terrifying question. He demanded to know exactly where the physical $3.5 million was currently located. I was standing in the middle of a federal crime scene, accused of massive municipal embezzlement, and the stolen cash was directly beneath our feet. The heavy silence that followed Julian's accusation felt thick enough to suffocate a person. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal cruisers illuminated the falling mist, turning the damp night air into a chaotic kaleidoscope of color. The lead investigator of the Internal Revenue Service stood directly in front of me. His hand rested casually on his utility belt. His eyes locked onto mine, searching my face for the slightest hint of panic. He fully expected me to crumble under the massive weight of a billionaire pointing the finger at me. He expected the tears and the desperate denials of a guilty embezzler caught in the act. I gave him absolutely nothing. "Where is the physical currency?" Maya, the federal agent, asked. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, and entirely professional. "If what this man says is true, you are currently obstructing a massive federal investigation." I did not immediately point to the muddy ground beneath our boots. I did not raise my voice to shout over the idling engines of the armored police vehicles. Instead, I reached out slowly and tapped the cover of the thick black leather ledger he was already holding in his hands. "The answer to that question requires you to understand exactly what you are holding," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly even. I watched Julian's smug, confident smile waver just a fraction of an inch. He thought his accusation would paralyze me. He did not realize that I had spent my entire adult life building impenetrable defenses out of raw data. I looked the investigator dead in the eye and explained exactly what happened after my sister Elise first attempted to gaslight me days prior. After she stormed out of my freezing house, I had locked the deadbolts, drawn the rotting blinds, and sparked my camping lantern. I spent 14 grueling hours sitting at a folding table, decoding that exact black ledger by the flickering amber light. I walked the federal agent through the numbers right there on the wet grass. The handwritten entries inside that book were an absolute masterclass in forensic obfuscation. Julian Pierce had engineered a brilliantly complex labyrinth of corporate deception. I explained how I mapped the dummy limited liability corporations. I traced the offshore wire transfers routing through the Cayman Islands and banking institutions in Cyprus. I detailed the inflated municipal contracts where the city was billed millions of dollars for structural concrete and commercial rebar that simply never existed. As I cracked the accounting cipher sitting in the dark isolation of the abandoned bungalow, I realized my initial theory was completely wrong. The $3.5 million hidden behind the biometric steel door was not cartel blood money. It was not the proceeds of violent narcotics trafficking. It was highly sophisticated white-collar fraud orchestrated from the leather chairs of an exclusive country club. But it was the final reconciliation column on the very last page of the ledger that hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I told the investigator to turn to the final page. He flipped open the leather cover, clicking on his tactical flashlight to illuminate the crisp, handwritten digits. The total physical cash sitting in my hidden vault matched the exact deficit missing from the county teachers' pension fund. A profound, heavy stillness settled over the federal agents standing within earshot. That specific municipal pension fund was not just a random account to me. My late father was a high school history teacher in this exact county. He spent 40 years of his life standing in front of chalkboards and grading papers at our cramped kitchen table. He lived a modest, disciplined life, relying entirely on the promise of that specific retirement fund. I described to the investigator the exact day the fund mysteriously collapsed. I remembered watching my father hold a formal letter from the county stating his retirement account had been suddenly restructured into nothing. He was told the municipal investments had simply failed. He had worked his entire life to secure his future, and Julian Pierce stole it with a fountain pen to fund his luxury real estate empire. My father was stripped of his dignity and his security. He was forced to take a grueling job working double shifts driving a commercial delivery truck just to pay his monthly mortgage. He worked himself into the ground until his exhausted heart finally gave out on a loading dock at 64 years old. Julian and Trent had not just stolen anonymous tax dollars. They had stolen my father's hard-earned retirement. They were the direct reason he died, exhausted, broken, and completely robbed of his golden years. I explained to the investigator that the heavy, wax-sealed envelope I found resting on the currency contained a single word typed on cardstock: alibi. That word was not a threat directed at me. It was the master decryption key to the offshore accounts listed in the ledger. The cash inside the vault was their untraceable emergency escape fund. They kept physical currency on hand just in case the federal authorities ever froze their digital assets. When I finally connected the math to my father's death, the lingering fear I had been carrying completely vanished. It was instantly replaced by a cold, absolute clarity. This entire ordeal was no longer about defending a $200 real estate investment at a public auction. It was about profound, righteous vengeance. Julian Pierce and my cheating ex-husband had used complex math to destroy my family, and I was going to use their own math to execute them publicly. The lead investigator lowered his flashlight. The skepticism in his eyes had entirely dissolved, replaced by the sharp, focused intensity of a man who just realized he had caught the biggest predator of his career. "So where is the escape fund?" Maya the agent asked again, his tone now laced with quiet respect. I finally pointed toward the front porch of the flooded, ruined house. When Julian intentionally severed the power grid and sent his mercenaries to demolish the structure, I knew they would breach the master bedroom vault, I said. So I emptied the biometric room completely. I carried every single vacuum-sealed brick of currency into the living room. I pried up the original oak hardwood floorboards in the center of the room and packed the money tightly into the deep structural joists. When your men go inside, tell them to rip up the woven rug and pull the wood. The pension fund is sitting right there. Julian's jaw dropped. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a pale, terrified ghost. He realized in that exact moment that I had not just discovered his money, I had actively weaponized the architecture of the house against him. I had lured his mercenaries inside, trapped his son-in-law in a steel coffin, and flooded the basement, all while keeping the physical evidence perfectly hidden and secure. The lead investigator signaled to a team of agents. 4 officers waded through the thick mud, climbing the porch steps and entering the dark house. We stood in silence on the lawn, listening to the sound of crowbars ripping up ancient oak floorboards. 3 minutes later, an agent emerged from the front door, carrying 2 heavy canvas duffel bags. He unzipped the canvas, revealing the stacks of $100 bills. The evidence was secured. The $3.5 million was officially recovered. Julian Pierce slumped forward, his shoulders sagging in absolute defeat. His empire was reduced to muddy boots and federal handcuffs. I took a deep breath, feeling the crushing weight of the last 2 months finally lifting off my chest. I had won. My father was finally avenged. But my quiet victory lap was violently interrupted. The screech of heavy tires broke the relative calm of the crime scene. A sleek black luxury town car aggressively breached the outer police perimeter, ignoring the shouting traffic cops. The vehicle slammed into park right behind the federal cruisers. The rear door swung open, and a man wearing a pristine charcoal suit stepped out into the mist. He carried a slim titanium briefcase and radiated an aura of expensive, untouchable authority. It was Julian's lead defense attorney, a man notorious for burying federal prosecutors in endless mountains of fabricated paperwork. The attorney marched directly toward the lead investigator, completely ignoring the armed agents surrounding him. He popped the latches on his titanium briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of digitally verified federal documents. My client, Julian Pierce, is the victim of a highly sophisticated cybercrime, the attorney announced, his voice booming across the lawn. He shoved the paperwork into the chest of the lead investigator. I watched the agent's eyes scan the top page, and a deep frown creased his forehead. The attorney turned his sharp, predatory gaze directly toward me. He pointed at the documents. "We have the verified municipal holding logs dating back 3 years," he declared loudly. "The $3.5 million currently sitting in those canvas bags was officially transferred into a blind trust registered directly to the Social Security number of Maya Sterling. She did not find that money tonight. She planted it there to frame my client." My blood ran completely cold. Julian had not just built a physical failsafe inside the hidden vault. He had built a digital failsafe inside the municipal registry. Years before I ever bought the house at the county auction, Julian had created a massive, fabricated digital paper trail officially framing me as the primary embezzler of the pension fund. He had used my name, my identity, and my credentials as a tax auditor to shield himself. The lead investigator slowly looked up from the forged documents. He handed the black ledger to a subordinate. He took a single step toward me, unhooking the heavy metal handcuffs from his utility belt. The man who had just respected my brilliance was now legally obligated to arrest me for the very crime I had just exposed. The heavy metal handcuffs clinked with a terrifying finality as the lead federal investigator unhooked them from his utility belt. The rain was falling harder now, mixing with the thick mud on my ruined front lawn. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the pristine charcoal suit of Julian's expensive defense attorney. The lawyer stood tall, radiating an aura of absolute smug victory. He believed his fabricated digital paper trail was the ultimate trump card. He assumed that a massive stack of forged municipal holding logs, placing the stolen $3.5 million directly into a blind trust under my name, would instantly neutralize me. Julian Pierce let out a breath he had been holding. A nasty, triumphant smile spread across his muddy face. He looked at me, expecting to see absolute terror. He expected me to beg for mercy or scream that I was being framed. I did not move a single inch. I looked at the heavy steel handcuffs dangling from the federal agent's hand, and then I looked directly at the high-priced attorney. You should always verify the metadata before you hand fabricated evidence to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division, I said. My voice was perfectly calm, cutting through the noise of the idling armored vehicles. The attorney's confident smile wavered slightly. The lead investigator paused, his thumb resting on the locking mechanism of the handcuffs. He looked between me and the lawyer, his eyes narrowing with deep suspicion. I reached into my canvas tote bag. I had not just brought the black leather ledger to this confrontation. I am a forensic municipal tax auditor. I spend my entire life anticipating the exact methods corrupt men use to hide their crimes. When Trent and Julian started their campaign of systemic intimidation weeks ago, I knew they would eventually try to legally tie me to the stolen pension funds. Trent had already attempted a similar tactic in family court, using backdated documents to claim my property. I knew exactly how their forgery network operated. I pulled a thick, certified digital forensics affidavit from my bag and handed it directly to the lead investigator. I told the agent to look closely at the third page of the lawyer's supposedly official municipal documents. I pointed to the digital notary stamp printed at the bottom of the blind trust agreement. The document claimed that the trust holding the stolen $3.5 million was established 3 years ago using my Social Security number. That is a very impressive forgery, I explained, keeping my tone strictly professional. But it contains a fatal chronological error. The digital notary stamp on that paper features a highly specific state certification seal. The state of California updated the design of that particular seal, adding a microscopic watermark to combat fraud. That specific updated design was not officially issued by the state until 6 months after my divorce from Trent was finalized. The silence that fell over the crime scene was absolute. The only sound was the steady drum of rain hitting the hoods of the police cruisers. I looked the defense attorney right in the eyes. Therefore, a document legally dated 3 years ago could not possibly bear a notary stamp that did not even exist until 18 months ago. You did not just bring a fabricated document to a crime scene. You just officially submitted forged evidence to a federal officer in the middle of an active embezzlement investigation. The color completely drained from the attorney's face. His pristine charcoal suit suddenly looked entirely inadequate. The arrogant, untouchable aura he radiated just moments before shattered into a million tiny pieces. He was a highly educated man, and he realized in a fraction of a second that Julian Pierce had just tricked him into committing a massive federal felony. Submitting fraudulent legal documents to manipulate a federal money laundering probe carries a mandatory prison sentence. The lawyer did not try to argue. He did not attempt to defend his billionaire client. He simply snapped his titanium briefcase shut, clicked the locks, and took 3 rapid steps backward. He invoked his right to remain silent, turning his back on Julian completely. He walked briskly back to his luxury town car, abandoning the corrupt developer in the mud. Julian Pierce watched his invincible legal shield drive away. The triumphant smile vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. His chest heaved as he struggled to process the total collapse of his billion-dollar empire. He had relied on lawyers, bureaucrats, and mercenaries to protect him his entire life. Now, every single one of those defenses had been systematically dismantled by a woman he told to settle for garbage. The lead investigator looked at the certified forensics affidavit in his hand. He verified the dates. He looked at the forged documents the lawyer had left behind. He slowly hooked the heavy steel handcuffs back onto his utility belt. He turned his attention away from me and focused entirely on the mastermind standing in the sludge. The federal agents swarmed Julian. They secured his wrists behind his back, reading him his rights over the sound of the torrential rain. Down the driveway, Trent was being shoved into the back of a heavily armored transport vehicle, still weeping and shivering from his time locked inside the biometric vault. The raid was an absolute, total success. The stolen physical currency was secured. The primary conspirators were in federal custody. The physical threat against my life was permanently neutralized. The lead investigator walked back over to me. He extended his hand, shaking mine with a firm, respectful grip. He told me that my forensic auditing work was the most brilliant display of civilian intelligence he had ever witnessed in his 20-year career. He assured me that Julian and Trent were going away for a very long time. I felt a profound sense of relief wash over my tired muscles. My father's stolen retirement fund was finally recovered. The men who destroyed his final years were currently sitting in the back of police cars. I thought the war was finally over. But as the investigator turned to leave, he delivered a piece of bureaucratic reality that hit me harder than any physical blow. He explained that while the $3.5 million was successfully recovered, it was now officially classified as primary evidence in a massive federal racketeering case. The physical cash would be securely locked inside an evidence vault for the entire duration of the criminal trial. He told me that federal white-collar fraud trials typically take 3 to 5 years to conclude. My heart sank into my stomach. 3 to 5 years. The retired municipal teachers, including the men and women my father had worked alongside for 4 decades, did not have 3 to 5 years. Their pension accounts were currently completely empty. Many of them were facing immediate foreclosure on their homes this very month. Recovering the physical money meant absolutely nothing if the elderly pensioners lost their houses while the cash sat inside a government locker. I asked the investigator if there was any way to expedite the return of the funds to the county pension system. He shook his head grimly. He explained that the only entity with the power to issue emergency bridge funding to save the retired teachers was the sitting city council. The exact same corrupt city council that had deliberately looked the other way while Julian Pierce looted the treasury in the first place. I looked down the street, watching the taillights of the federal cruisers disappear into the rainy night. The physical battle for my abandoned house was finished, but the systemic war was just beginning. Julian and Trent were going to prison, but the politicians who enabled them were still sitting in their comfortable leather chairs in City Hall. Those corrupt officials knew that Julian kept a black ledger. They knew that if my forensic audit became entirely public, their own complicity would be exposed. They were not going to issue emergency funding to save the teachers. They were going to do everything in their considerable power to bury the story, discredit my findings, and protect their own lucrative political careers. My phone buzzed in my damp pocket. It was an automated news alert from a local media outlet. The headline made my blood run cold. It read, "Municipal auditor investigated for bizarre real estate scam." The corrupt city council was already making their move. While I was busy fighting mercenaries in the mud, the politicians were launching a massive coordinated media smear campaign against me. They wanted to destroy my public reputation so completely that nobody would ever believe my forensic report about the stolen pension funds. They were going to paint me as a bitter, unstable woman who manipulated the system. I stood alone on the ruined lawn of the house I bought for $200. The rain washed the mud from my boots. I had defeated a billionaire and a private military squad. Now I had to figure out how to defeat an entire corrupted municipal government before the morning news cycle destroyed my life forever. The rain continued to wash over the muddy lawn of my ruined property. I was standing in the dark, watching the red and blue taillights of the federal cruisers fade into the misty distance. The physical battle for my home was finally over, but the systemic war was escalating with terrifying speed. My phone vibrated endlessly with automated news alerts. The corrupt city council was actively launching a massive coordinated media smear campaign against me. They were desperately trying to paint me as an unstable criminal, to discredit my forensic audit and protect their own lucrative political careers. I knew a massive digital breach of my entire life was imminent. The politicians were going to use their high-level administrative access to erase the municipal pension records, destroy my professional credentials, and bury the truth forever. They wanted to ensure that even though Julian Pierce was in federal custody, the underlying municipal corruption remained perfectly intact. I walked to my nondescript sedan, climbed inside, and locked the heavy doors. I drove away from the flooded house, leaving the nightmare behind me. I navigated through the quiet morning streets and checked into a cheap, anonymous motel on the industrial edge of the county. I did not turn on the television. I did not answer my ringing phone. I sat down at the sticky laminate desk, opened my laptop, and connected to a highly secure, encrypted network. I had to save the retired teachers and their stolen pension fund today. The physical $3.5 million was legally locked in a federal evidence locker for the next 3 years, pending a massive racketeering trial. But Julian Pierce and his political allies did not steal just one single sum of money. They had been draining the city dry for a decade. I knew they had to have a secondary reserve. I opened the digital high-resolution scans of the black leather ledger. I re-examined the complex architecture of their financial network. I did not look at the raw money this time. I looked at the actual engineering of their corruption. Corrupt billionaires and compromised politicians do not build illegal empires without sophisticated, highly engineered contingencies. Scanning the offshore routing panels and the hidden municipal budget codes, I spotted a brilliant, hidden mechanism. It was buried deep inside the city's emergency reserve accounts, beneath layers of encrypted administrative firewalls. It was a pressure-sensitive digital weight plate. It was not a primary password lock. It was a highly classified secondary failsafe designed by the city council. If an unauthorized municipal auditor like me attempted to access the reserve funds, the system would detect the digital weight shift instantly. It would automatically trigger a mechanical deadbolt within the banking software, slamming the offshore accounts permanently shut. The system was designed to instantly route the remaining stolen taxpayer money into an untraceable dark web cryptocurrency wallet. The politicians had built a digital panic room to protect their illicit slush fund in case Julian was ever arrested and forced to cooperate with the authorities. I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop. The green text reflected in my tired eyes. The city council thought they were invincible because they controlled the municipal servers. But they fundamentally forgot that I am the exact person who audits and dissects their software for a living. I immediately spent the next 6 grueling hours executing a highly complex cyber relocation. My hands cramped over the keyboard and my coffee grew ice cold. But I did not stop typing. I bypassed the primary municipal firewalls and accessed the emergency reserve network using a ghost credential. I carefully extracted the stolen taxpayer funds, transferring the digital assets brick by brick out of the corrupt slush fund. I did not steal a single penny for myself. I systematically relocated $68 million of embezzled municipal capital directly into the publicly accessible county teachers' pension disbursement system. I completely bypassed the frozen physical cash sitting in the federal evidence locker. I replaced the locked money with the politicians' own hidden illicit reserves. The retired teachers were going to receive their full retirement checks on Monday morning, regardless of what the federal prosecutors did with the physical currency. Once the massive transfer was fully complete, I left the City Council's illegal digital vault entirely empty. But I did not log out of the mainframe. I carefully rewrote the underlying security code, resetting the digital pressure plate to its absolute most sensitive calibration. I turned their sophisticated financial failsafe into an inescapable public trap. If any corrupt official attempted to log in to authorize the media smear campaign payments, the highly sensitive plate would trigger. But this time, the automated deadbolt would not secure their stolen money. It would instantly publish their complete internet browsing histories, private campaign bank statements, and documented corporate bribes directly to the front page of the county newspaper website. I positioned hidden tracking algorithms throughout the municipal digital hallway network, ensuring I would be notified the second someone stepped into the trap. I closed my laptop, packed my canvas bag, and left the dreary motel room. I drove downtown as the sun began to rise over the city skyline. I parked my car 3 blocks away from City Hall, hiding deep in the shadows of a concrete parking garage. I had successfully turned the politician's billion-dollar digital panic room into a razor-sharp steel mousetrap. The trap was set, the bait was placed, and the mechanism was fully armed. Now, all I needed was the mouse to take the barest nibble of the cheese. I sat in the absolute silence of my vehicle, watching the heavy marble columns of the municipal government building. The city was slowly waking up, completely unaware of the massive financial earthquake currently sitting just beneath the surface of the internet. The morning news radio was playing softly from my dashboard speakers. The anchors were already reading the fabricated press releases provided by the city council, calling me a disgruntled civil servant who orchestrated a bizarre real estate scam. They were digging their own graves with every single broadcast. At exactly 7:15 in the morning, my encrypted phone buzzed violently against the center console. Motion detected in the basement of the server. I leaned forward, staring intently at the tracking algorithms scrolling rapidly across my screen. Someone was actively logging into the highly restricted emergency reserve accounts using an encrypted administrative terminal located directly inside City Hall. It was not a low-level clerk or a junior staff member. The biometric digital signature belonged to Mayor Richard Sterling. He was the most powerful politician in the entire county and the exact man orchestrating the vicious media smear campaign against my reputation. Mayor Sterling had spent the last decade presenting himself as the ultimate champion of the public school system, while secretly helping Julian Pierce drain the teacher pension funds dry. He was a man who shook hands at charity galas and then signed embezzlement authorizations in the dark. The mayor had finally arrived to secure his illicit funds. I watched the thermal processing signature spike on my tracking software. Mayor Sterling was navigating through the digital hallway, completely unaware that the floor beneath his feet was rigged to collapse. He bypassed the standard security protocols and accessed the primary vault directory. He was looking for the $68 million he needed to fund his upcoming re-election campaign and pay off his crisis management public relations firm. He initiated the command to open the reserve accounts. He stepped squarely onto the hypersensitive digital pressure plate. I held my breath as the tracking software registered the massive unauthorized weight shift. The automated mechanical deadbolt engaged with a flawless mathematical precision. I did not need to be inside his opulent corner office to know exactly what was happening. I could picture the color draining from his perfectly tanned face as the error messages flooded his computer monitors. The trap sprang with absolute devastating efficiency. The empty vault locked him inside the system, preventing him from severing his connection to the mainframe. And then the secondary payload deployed perfectly into the wild. The digital payload executed with an absolutely flawless mathematical precision. I sat inside my freezing sedan parked in the deep shadows of the concrete municipal parking garage located just 3 blocks away from City Hall. I watched the glowing screen of my laptop as Mayor Sterling's entire corrupt political history was systematically dumped directly onto the public servers of the county newspaper. The automated algorithms I had designed were ripping through his encrypted files, exposing decades of corporate bribes, illegal campaign contributions, and offshore wire transfers. It was a masterpiece of forensic retribution. But compiling a massive data leak is only one half of a successful federal whistleblowing operation. To ensure that the high-priced defense attorneys could never dismiss my findings as a fabricated cyber attack, I needed to append the physical evidence of their malicious intent. I needed to attach the raw security footage proving that these powerful men were actively resorting to violent crimes to protect their stolen pension funds. While the massive digital transfer slowly processed over the encrypted cellular network, I reached into my canvas tote bag and pulled out my high-resolution tablet. I opened the saved video directories from the hidden cellular cameras I had strategically placed inside the abandoned property last night. I needed to review the exact sequence of events to timestamp the federal evidence file. I clicked the play button and watched the infrared feed on my tablet, the dark screen illuminated with the ghostly green and white thermal imaging of my ruined house. The timestamp in the bottom corner read 1:15 in the morning. I watched as a bright heat signature bypassed the heavy front door completely. Instead, the figure slipped quietly through a narrow, broken basement window on the side of the structure. It was my ex-husband. Trent carried a heavy canvas duffel bag strapped tightly across his chest and grasped a suppressed firearm in his right hand. I paused the video feed, taking a slow, deep breath of the crisp morning air circulating through my cracked car window. Watching the man I once promised to spend my life with actively hunting through a dark house with a weapon intended for me was a profoundly surreal experience. Trent was always a man who deeply desired the lavish rewards of extreme wealth without ever wanting to do the actual heavy lifting required to earn it. When he abandoned our marriage for the billionaire developer Julian Pierce's daughter, he genuinely thought he was marrying into absolute invincibility. He traded a loyal, practical wife for a high society family that viewed him merely as an asset on a corporate balance sheet. I pressed play and watched his thermal outline navigate the dark, narrow hallway of the first floor. As I analyzed his cautious movements, a terrifying and chilling realization suddenly washed over me. I cross-referenced the timestamp on the video with the encrypted communication logs I was currently extracting from the mayor's compromised servers. Julian Pierce and Mayor Sterling had actively coordinated this specific midnight break-in, but they had intentionally sent Trent entirely alone. Why would a ruthless billionaire with infinite resources and a corrupted politician with everything to lose send a soft real estate developer to retrieve $3.5 million in stolen physical cash? The answer was cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of human empathy. Julian intimately knew about the secondary mechanical failsafe hidden inside the biometric vault. Trent clearly did not. Trent was never a trusted business partner in their massive money laundering syndicate. He was completely expendable bait. Julian and the mayor were desperately hoping that Trent would infiltrate the house, grab the heavy currency, trigger the floor trap, and get caught absolutely red-handed by the authorities. They orchestrated the entire scenario to use my ex-husband as the ultimate sacrificial scapegoat. Trent would take the catastrophic legal fall as the lone rogue embezzler. His arrest would perfectly insulate Julian's luxury real estate empire and completely protect the mayor's lucrative political career. Trent had sold his soul to sit at the billionaire table, never once realizing that he was specifically selected to be the main course. I watched the screen as Trent finally reached the master bedroom. He saw the massive open steel vault and eagerly stepped inside the dark space, raising his tactical flashlight. I watched his glowing heat signature approach the back metal shelving, completely unaware of the lethal engineering hidden directly beneath his expensive boots. He stepped squarely onto the pressure-sensitive weight plate. Even through the compressed audio of the tablet speakers, the noise was absolutely terrifying. Instantly, a deafening mechanical clang echoed through the audio feed. The massive industrial steel door slammed shut with bone-crushing velocity. The highly engineered 4-inch titanium deadbolt slid deep into the reinforced concrete foundation, permanently locking the barrier. Trent dropped his flashlight in absolute shock. The thermal camera captured his frantic, desperate movements. He slammed his fists against the immovable steel door, screaming in sheer, unfiltered terror. But he was screaming into a pitch-black, soundproof void with absolutely zero cellular service. He was buried alive, trapped in a permanent concrete coffin designed and built by his own father-in-law. I stopped the video playback and attached the crucial file to the federal evidence package. The dramatic irony of Trent's demise was mathematically perfect. He had mocked me for buying a house he considered garbage, and that very same garbage had swallowed him whole. My laptop chimed with a sharp, high-pitched notification. The progress bar for the municipal data leak hit 100%. The massive transfer was officially complete. Every single news agency, investigative journalist, and federal prosecutor in the state was currently waking up to the undeniable digital proof of the mayor's vast corruption. The political earthquake had officially struck. I smiled, feeling a profound sense of poetic justice settling deep into my exhausted muscles. I had successfully dismantled an entire corrupted ecosystem using nothing but historical blueprints, public soil reports, and forensic accounting. But my quiet moment of victory in the dark parking garage was violently and abruptly interrupted. The screen of my laptop suddenly flashed a harsh, glaring, crimson warning. The sophisticated municipal cybersecurity defense grid had not merely locked the mayor out of his illicit funds. The highly advanced administrative system had automatically initiated a hostile reverse trace the moment the massive data packet breached the external firewall. Because I was legally forced to transfer a massive volume of data to expose the entire decade of systemic bribery the download had taken, exactly 12 minutes to complete. That was a massive window of exposure in the cybersecurity world. The city's automated defense network had pinged my secure connection and successfully triangulated my exact geographic location before I could manually sever the ghost credential. The corrupt politicians now knew exactly where the hacker was hiding. I quickly slammed my laptop shut and shoved it into my canvas tote bag. I reached for the ignition key of my sedan, intending to flee the structure immediately. But before my fingers could even turn the key, my perimeter cameras pinged with a loud, frantic alert. When I first parked my vehicle in the concrete structure 3 hours ago, I had quickly slapped 3 magnetic cellular cameras onto the concrete pillars overlooking the main entrance ramps. It was a standard auditing precaution to always monitor the primary avenues of approach. The night was far from over. I pulled up the live camera feed on my phone. 3 unmarked black tactical vans had just pulled aggressively off the main street and were rapidly accelerating up the spiral concrete ramp of the parking garage. These were not the armored cruisers of the federal authorities coming to ask me questions. These were not the local police responding to a routine disturbance. These were the mayor's highly paid private fixers. The corrupt political machine had deployed a desperate, heavily armed strike team to silence the whistleblower before the morning news anchors could verify the catastrophic data leak. The heavy tactical vans screeched to a halt, blocking the only exit ramp leading down to the street level. The heavy sliding doors slammed open, and a dozen men wearing dark tactical gear poured out onto the concrete decking. They spread out in a disciplined military formation, sweeping the rows of parked cars with high-powered flashlights. They were moving systematically toward my exact location. I was trapped on the 3rd floor of a concrete structure, surrounded by heavily armed mercenaries who had absolutely nothing left to lose. My forensic algorithm had successfully destroyed their financial empire, but raw data could not stop a bullet. I grabbed my heavy steel crowbar from the passenger seat, took a deep breath, and opened my car door. I had to use the concrete environment of the garage to outsmart a tactical assault team, because running was no longer an option. While the automated digital algorithms were actively stripping the corrupt mayor of his political armor, my physical reality was rapidly deteriorating. I was sitting inside my freezing sedan parked perfectly in the deep shadows, just 3 blocks away from my abandoned property. I watched the infrared feed on my tablet as my ex-husband screamed silently from inside the locked biometric vault. His heat signature thrashed against the immovable titanium barrier, completely trapped in a concrete coffin of his own making. The initial phase of my plan had executed flawlessly. But Julian Pierce was not a man who possessed the patience for failure. He viewed his son-in-law as a disposable asset, but he viewed the stolen $3.5 million as his ultimate lifeline. Exactly 1 minute after the heavy deadbolt slammed shut, trapping Trent inside the foundation, the streetlights illuminating the quiet residential block began to hum violently. I watched through my windshield as the high-voltage transformers mounted on the wooden utility poles sparked with a bright blue intensity. A harsh mechanical whine vibrated through the crisp night air, and then the transformers died completely. The entire neighborhood was instantly plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. Julian had leveraged his massive municipal influence to bypass the standard utility protocols. He had forced a targeted, localized grid blackout, specifically isolating my street from the rest of the county infrastructure. He was blinding the neighborhood to mask the sheer brutality of his upcoming assaults. Under the heavy cover of the total power outage, 3 unmarked black tactical vans rolled aggressively down the street. They did not use their headlights to navigate. The drivers steered the massive vehicles over the pitch-black asphalt using military-grade night vision equipment. The heavy vans screeched to a halt directly in front of my sagging porch, forming a solid steel barricade across my front lawn. The side doors slid open with a synchronized mechanical thud that echoed through the empty block. 15 men poured out of the vehicles. They were not local street enforcers or desperate criminals looking for a quick payday. They wore matching dark tactical gear, heavy ballistic vests, and thick combat boots. These were Julian's private security contractors, highly paid mercenaries brought in to execute an illegal demolition. Through my binoculars, I could see them pulling massive gas-powered concrete saws, heavy steel sledgehammers, and hydraulic breaching rams from the rear cargo compartments. They did not plan to pick the locks or negotiate a peaceful surrender. They were going to dismantle my residence by absolute blunt force, cut the titanium vault directly out of the foundation, and bury my body deep in the resulting rubble. They operated with the terrifying efficiency of a professional strike team, entirely unrestrained by the law. I was sitting alone in a cheap sedan outnumbered 15-1 by heavily armed operatives. A normal person would have slammed their transmission into gear and driven as fast as possible in the opposite direction. But I had spent my entire adult career anticipating hostile audits. I do not panic when the numbers are stacked against me. I simply adjust the math until the leverage shifts back into my favor. I opened my laptop and bypassed my own internal security firewalls to access my heavily encrypted cloud server. Before I ever stepped foot inside that abandoned bungalow, I had designed a catastrophic digital insurance policy. I called it a dead man switch, but in reality, it was a targeted forensic missile. I initiated the final command sequence. A massive automated email instantly fired through the secure cellular network. The recipient list was deliberately chosen to ensure maximum public exposure and absolutely zero bureaucratic suppression. I sent the package directly to the State Attorney General, the Regional Director of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division, and the senior investigative editors of 3 major national news syndicates. The communication did not contain emotional pleas or vague accusations. It contained the fully translated black leather ledger in high-resolution digital scans. It attached the verified offshore shell company routing numbers and the specific banking institutions located in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands. It provided the exact decryption password alibi required to unlock the hidden accounts. Most importantly, it broadcasted the precise global positioning coordinates of the stolen $3.5 million currently sitting directly inside the structural floor joists of my living room. I watched the progress bar hit 100%, confirming the delivery. I locked my tablet and closed the laptop screen. The flashing cursor disappeared, leaving me in the dark. The hourglass had officially flipped. The clock was no longer ticking for me. It was ticking loudly and violently for Julian Pierce. Federal agents were already scrambling out of their beds, pulling on their tactical gear, and preparing to hunt the biggest white-collar predator in the state. But federal response times are measured in minutes, and I only had seconds before the mercenaries breached the front door. I could not simply wait in my car listening to the destruction. If the strike team tore the structure apart, they would eventually find the cash hidden in the floorboards, and they would secure the physical evidence before the authorities arrived. I had to physically delay the extraction operation. I popped the latch on my car door and slipped silently out into the freezing night air. The rain had started to fall in a fine misty drizzle, dampening the sound of my footsteps against the wet asphalt. I pulled the hood of my dark jacket over my head and gripped my heavy steel crowbar tightly in my right hand. I moved quickly, sticking to the deep, impenetrable shadows cast by the overgrown oak trees lining the sidewalk. I bypassed the front of the property entirely. The tactical contractors had established a strict perimeter around the front porch, their high-powered flashlights cutting through the darkness like white lasers. I could hear the aggressive shouts of the team leader barking orders to spark the heavy demolition saws. The harsh smell of gasoline and toxic exhaust fumes began to choke the damp air. The roar of the internal combustion engines revving up sent a shiver down my spine. I navigated through the neighboring overgrown backyards, slipping carefully over a rusted chain-link fence to access the rear of my property. My objective was not to fight 15 armed men in a physical confrontation. Engaging them directly would be absolute suicide. My objective was to use the historical architecture of the house to spring a catastrophic physical trap. The ground beneath my boots felt exceptionally soft and spongy, confirming exactly what I had read in the geological soil reports weeks ago. The house was sitting directly on top of a highly pressurized underground water table. The sheer volume of liquid trapped beneath the topsoil was immense. I crouched low against the rotting wooden siding of the back wall. The noise from the front of the house was growing deafening as the mercenaries finally smashed the front door off its hinges with a heavy steel ram. They were pouring into the main hallway, marching directly over the hidden currency, entirely focused on reaching the master bedroom. I located the narrow, broken basement window Trent had utilized earlier in the night. I gripped my crowbar and prepared to slide feet first into the pitch-black subterranean level of the house. Julian Pierce had brought a private army of brute force to steal his money back, but I was bringing the devastating, unstoppable power of elementary physics. I slid feet first through the broken, narrow window frame, dropping silently onto the packed dirt floor of the subterranean basement. The air down here was incredibly thick, tasting of ancient dust, dry rot, and forgotten decades. Complete darkness enveloped my surroundings, but I did not dare turn on my flashlight. Doing so would instantly reveal my position to the hostile forces actively invading the property. I pressed my back against the damp concrete foundation wall and forced my breathing to slow down. Directly above my head, the original oak floorboards groaned and shrieked under the sheer physical weight of 15 heavily armed tactical contractors. The noise was absolutely deafening. I could hear their thick combat boots stomping across the living room, directly over the exact structural joists where I had meticulously hidden the 35,000 individual $100 bills. Fine white powder and flakes of century-old plaster rained down through the wooden ceiling cracks, dusting my shoulders and stinging my eyes. The mercenaries were sweeping the dark house with high-powered tactical flashlights. The bright beams occasionally sliced through the floorboard gaps, illuminating the swirling dust motes in the basement air. I heard the aggressive, commanding shouts of the strike team leader. He was barking frantic orders, directing his men to move down the narrow hallway toward the master bedroom. They had located the biometric vault. A moment later, the harsh, violent roar of a massive gas-powered concrete demolition saw shattered the quiet night. The mercenaries were firing up their heavy industrial equipment, preparing to slice directly through the titanium hinges of the bank-grade door. The acrid smell of gasoline and toxic exhaust fumes quickly seeped down through the floorboards, choking the stagnant basement air. They were minutes away from realizing the steel enclosure was completely empty. Once they discovered the missing currency, they would systematically tear the entire historic structure apart, brick by brick, until they found the cash. I did not have minutes. I only had seconds. I crept away from the safety of the concrete wall, moving blindly through the pitch-black subterranean space. I kept my hands extended, feeling my way through the darkness, until my fingertips brushed against a cold, thick iron pipe protruding from the earth. This was the exact target I had been searching for. When I first purchased this abandoned property at the county auction, Trent had mocked me, claiming I was buying toxic garbage. He thought I was a naive auditor settling for a worthless teardown. But Trent never possessed the intellectual discipline to read historical municipal archives. I had spent hours studying the original 1928 geological soil reports before I ever raised my bidding paddle. Those public documents revealed a massive geographical secret. This specific parcel of coastal land was sitting directly on top of a highly pressurized, volatile underground water table. The original architects knew about the massive hydrostatic pressure building beneath the topsoil. To prevent the historic bungalow from shifting, they had engineered the foundation expansion joints to deliberately manage and distribute the immense aquatic force. The house was essentially a tightly coiled structural spring resting precariously on the subterranean ocean. I ran my hands down the freezing iron pipe until I found the main municipal water line. Attached to the thick metal cylinder was a massive, heavy brass irrigation valve. This single, rusted mechanism was the only thing holding back the immense, crushing pressure of the city water grid. Julian Pierce had deployed a private army of brute force, expecting a conventional, physical confrontation. I was about to unleash the devastating, unstoppable power of elementary physics. I gripped my heavy steel crowbar tightly in both hands. I widened my stance, planting my boots firmly into the dry, packed dirt. I listened to the roaring gas-powered saws tearing into the steel vault directly above my head. I channeled every single ounce of adrenaline, frustration, and righteous anger I had accumulated over the past 2 months into my shoulders. I swung the steel crowbar with maximum kinetic force, aiming directly for the rusted iron coupling of the brass irrigation valve. The heavy tool struck the metal joint with a violent, bone-jarring impact. The rusted iron did not simply crack, it catastrophically shattered. 80 pounds per square inch of highly pressurized municipal water instantly exploded into the confined basement. The sheer physical force of the eruption knocked me backward off my feet. I slammed into the wet dirt, gasping for air, as the roaring torrent of freezing liquid filled the subterranean space with terrifying speed. The sound was like a roaring freight train tearing through a narrow tunnel. The massive volume of pressurized water violently mixed with the dry, volatile soil beneath the cracked foundation. Within 60 seconds, the basement transformed from a dusty cellar into a churning, inescapable vortex of thick, viscous mud. The historical foundation acted exactly like a released spring, amplifying the chaotic upward surge of the trapped liquid. I scrambled desperately up the concrete retaining wall, fighting against the rising tide. The heavy glue-like mud pulled at my boots, threatening to drag me under the freezing surface. I grabbed the jagged edge of the broken window frame and hauled my upper body through the narrow opening, tumbling out onto the wet exterior grass, just as the muddy water crested the basement ceiling. I rolled onto my back, gasping for crisp night air, and listened to the beautiful, devastating chaos unfolding inside the structure. The pressurized muddy water did not stop in the basement. It surged violently upward, exploding through the gaps in the original oak floorboards like a dozen miniature geysers. The main hallway and the living room were instantly flooded with 2 feet of thick, dark sludge. The catastrophic environmental shift caught the highly trained mercenaries completely off guard. The surging water rapidly inundated their expensive industrial equipment. The heavy gas-powered demolition saws and portable electrical generators instantly short-circuited. Bright blue electrical sparks violently showered the dark hallway, followed by the distinct popping sounds of dying machinery. The deafening roar of the cutting tools was abruptly silenced, replaced by the frantic, panicked shouting of 15 disoriented men. The thick, viscous mud coated the hardwood floors, turning the interior of the house into an incredibly dangerous, frictionless swamp. The heavy tactical boots worn by the contractors offered absolutely zero traction in the deep sludge. I could hear the massive mercenaries slipping, stumbling, and crashing heavily into the drywall. Their disciplined military formation completely disintegrated into total disorganized panic. They dropped their useless heavy tools into the muddy water, desperately trying to maintain their physical footing in the pitch-black darkness. The historic bungalow was actively fighting back against the hostile invasion, swallowing the intruders in a suffocating trap. I stood up, brushing the wet mud from my dark jacket, and walked calmly toward the front of the property. I remained perfectly hidden, just outside the reach of the sweeping flashlights. Julian Pierce was standing alone on the sagging front porch, entirely separated from his tactical team. The freezing, muddy water was actively spilling over the wooden threshold, rushing over the tips of his handmade Italian leather loafers. The pristine, immaculate cashmere overcoat he wore was currently splattered with thick, dark sludge. The untouchable billionaire was completely losing his pristine corporate composure. He was screaming frantic, furious orders into the dark, flooded house, demanding his men ignore the rising water and find the hidden currency immediately. He pounded his fists against the porch railing, throwing a desperate temper tantrum as he watched his expensive tactical operation dissolve into a muddy, humiliating failure. He realized his billion-dollar empire was sinking into the very garbage he had mocked me for buying. Julian turned his head, scanning the dark, overgrown lawn. He was searching for any sign of me. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated hatred and profound desperation. He knew I was out here somewhere, orchestrating his total demise. He opened his mouth, preparing to scream another vicious threat into the rainy night. But his words were instantly drowned out. The sharp, piercing wail of multiple heavy police sirens suddenly shattered the quiet residential neighborhood. A blinding wave of intense red and blue emergency lights reflected aggressively off Julian's ruined cashmere overcoat. The federal authorities had received my automated digital dossier, and they had arrived in massive, overwhelming numbers. Heavy armored federal vehicles turned aggressively onto the narrow street, completely barricading the escape routes of the unmarked tactical vans. The Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division, backed by heavily armed state police officers, swarmed the front lawn with their weapons drawn and their tactical shields raised. Julian Pierce froze on the porch, his eyes wide with absolute terror as the federal agents aimed their rifles directly at his chest. The physical assault was over, but the legal nightmare was just beginning. And as I watched the billionaire slowly raise his muddy hands into the air, I knew Julian still had one final desperate lie, prepared to destroy my life. The blinding red and blue strobe lights of the federal cruisers cut through the heavy falling mist, painting the flooded residential street in a chaotic mosaic of color. This brings us entirely full circle back to the exact moment I described at the very beginning of my story. It was exactly 2:14 in the morning when the tactical team officially breached my property. The Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division, backed by dozens of heavily armed state police officers, swarmed the overgrown front lawn. They moved with a terrifying synchronized efficiency. Their heavy boots splashed through the thick sludge that was rapidly spilling out of my front door and cascading down the cracked concrete steps. The highly paid private military contractors who had just spent the last 10 minutes slipping and thrashing inside my flooded living room realized their expensive operation was completely over. They did not attempt to raise their weapons or fight their way out of the trap. The mercenaries simply dropped their short-circuited heavy demolition saws and heavy steel sledgehammers directly into the viscous mud. They raised their hands in absolute defeat, dropping to their knees in the freezing water as the federal agents rapidly secured their wrists with heavy plastic zip ties. The House had broken their physical momentum, and the authorities had broken their legal immunity. I stepped out from the deep shadows of the overgrown oak trees. I did not hide or attempt to flee the chaotic crime scene. I calmly walked up my own front walkway, my boots squelching softly in the wet grass. I carried my bright amber camping lantern in my left hand, illuminating my path through the active raid. I climbed the porch steps, bypassing the prone bodies of the surrendered mercenaries. I retrieved my thermos from my canvas tote bag, unscrewed the metal cap, and slowly poured myself a steaming cup of black coffee. The rich, bitter aroma of the dark roast mixed beautifully with the sharp, metallic scent of the heavy rain and the electrical ozone left behind by the dying generators. I stood on my own porch, took a slow, deliberate sip of the hot liquid, and watched the lead federal investigator approach the property. Julian Pierce was already in custody. 2 state troopers had forced the arrogant billionaire developer face down against the hood of a police cruiser. They secured his wrists behind his back with heavy steel handcuffs. The pristine, immaculate cashmere overcoat he wore was completely ruined, stained with dark, sticky mud and soaking wet. His handmade Italian leather loafers were ruined. But even with the cold steel locked around his wrists, Julian's monumental arrogance refused to completely shatter. He saw me standing on the porch, calmly drinking my coffee, and his face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged desperation. He decided to play his absolute final card, relying on the lifelong assumption that law enforcement would always inherently believe a wealthy, white-collar titan over a simple municipal civil servant. "She stole it!" Julian screamed at the top of his lungs, pointing a trembling, muddy finger directly at me. His voice cracked with panic, echoing over the idling engines of the armored vehicles. "She is the one who embezzled the pension funds. She lured my security team here tonight to frame me for her own massive financial crimes. You have to arrest her right now." The lead federal investigator paused at the bottom of my porch steps. He looked up at me, his hand resting cautiously on his utility belt. He had received my digital dossier, but Julian was actively accusing me of orchestrating a complex frame job. I did not raise my voice to argue with the desperate billionaire. I did not offer a passionate, emotional defense of my character. I am a forensic tax auditor. I let the raw, undeniable data do the talking. I set my coffee cup down on the wooden railing. I reached into my canvas bag and pulled out the original, physical black leather ledger I had retrieved from the biometric vault. I walked down the steps and handed the book directly to the lead investigator. I then pulled out a thick, printed forensic tracing report I had compiled and handed that over as well. "You do not need to take my word for anything," I told the federal agent, keeping my tone perfectly measured and professional. Inside that ledger, you will find the exact dates and monetary values of every single illicit withdrawal Julian Pierce authorized from the county teacher's retirement system. I pointed back toward my flooded living room, where the authorities were currently wading through the dark sludge. If you instruct your evidence recovery team to pull up the original oak floorboards in the center of that room, they will find 35,000 individual, vacuum-sealed $100 bills. I explained calmly. I intentionally relocated the physical currency into the structural joists to protect it from his demolition crews. I want you to immediately compare the specific sequential serial numbers printed on that recovered cash directly against the county treasury withdrawal logs provided in my forensic report. Julian stopped screaming. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost in the flashing strobe lights. He knew exactly what the investigator would find. When a municipal bank distributes massive sums of physical currency, the Federal Reserve automatically logs the sequential serial numbers of the specific bills. My forensic report perfectly matched the serial numbers of the cash hidden in my floorboards to the exact batches of currency withdrawn by Julian's dummy shell corporations. It was absolute, undeniable, physical proof that Julian was the architect of the theft. The cash could not possibly belong to me because I never possessed the administrative clearance required to authorize those specific municipal bank transfers. The lead investigator reviewed the tracing report under the beam of his tactical flashlight. He nodded slowly, the last lingering shadow of doubt completely vanishing from his eyes. He signaled his deputies to secure the evidence and process the billionaire for immediate transport. But the operation was still missing one crucial piece of the puzzle. I pointed my finger toward the dark, narrow hallway leading to the back of the house. "You are going to need a heavy thermal breaching torch," I told the agents. "There is a hidden biometric steel vault located in the master bedroom, and there is a man currently locked inside it." A specialized federal tactical team waded through the flooded hallway, carrying heavy cutting equipment. For the next 20 minutes, the quiet residential street was filled with the blinding shower of white-hot sparks and the agonizing screech of melting titanium. The agents systematically destroyed the impregnable bank-grade door, slicing through the reinforced hinges and the automated mechanical deadbolt. Finally, with a massive, echoing groan, the heavy steel barrier was pried open. Trent was violently dragged out of the pitch-black, soundproof void and hauled out onto the front lawn into the blinding glare of the police lights. My flashy, arrogant ex-husband was completely unrecognizable. The man who had mocked me at the public auction wearing a $4,000 bespoke suit was now a pathetic, broken shell. He was covered in sweat grime and the muddy water he had been forced to crawl through. He was weeping uncontrollably, his body shaking with sheer, unfiltered terror. He had spent hours trapped inside a dark concrete coffin, fully believing his father-in-law was going to let him suffocate to death beneath the rubble. The agents secured Trent's wrists with zip ties and shoved him toward a waiting squad car parked directly next to Julian's cruiser. The moment Trent locked eyes with the older billionaire, the final remaining thread of their criminal alliance instantly vaporized. Trent did not ask for legal counsel. He did not invoke his right to remain silent. He immediately turned on the man he once idolized. He orchestrated the entire thing. Trent screamed hysterically, thrashing against the grip of the state troopers. Julian made me manipulate the city zoning codes. He forced me to hide the stolen pension money. He tried to leave me in that vault to die so he could take all the cash for himself. I will testify against him. I will tell you everything you want to know. It was the perfect Ouroboros of profound greed. They were actively devouring each other to save their own skins. Just as the troopers shoved my sobbing ex-husband into the back of the armored vehicle, a sleek silver Mercedes screeched to a halt right at the edge of the yellow police barricade tape. The driver's side door flew open, and my sister Elise stepped out onto the wet asphalt. She had likely heard the massive police sirens and rushed over, hoping to find me arrested and Julian's empire intact. Instead, she arrived just in time to witness the absolute, total annihilation of her meal ticket. Elise stood paralyzed at the police tape, clutching her expensive designer handbag. Her eyes were wide with horror as she watched Trent, her ticket to high society, weeping like a child in the back of a police car. She watched Julian Pierce, the man whose hush money she had chosen over her own blood, being read his federal Miranda rights. Elise slowly turned her head and locked eyes with me across the muddy, ruined lawn. Her face crumpled. She opened her mouth, stepping toward the barricade, preparing to offer another fake emotional apology, now that she realized she had backed the losing side. I did not smile. I did not frown. I simply looked right through her, as if she were completely invisible. I turned my back on my sister, picked up my thermos, and walked back onto my porch. Elise had made her choice, and now she would have to live with the profound emptiness of her reality. The physical threat was finally over. The money was secured, and the architects of the theft were in custody. But as I sat down at my folding table, surrounded by the destruction of my home, I knew the true war was far from finished. Julian and Trent were just the beneficiaries of the corruption. The political machine that actively enabled them, the corrupt city council, and the compromised municipal board, were still sitting comfortably in their offices, preparing to launch their media smear campaign against me at dawn. I had survived the night, but now I had to publicly execute an entire government before they could bury the truth forever. The morning after the chaotic federal raid, the sun rose over my flooded property, and the fallout hit the city like a massive seismic event. The corrupt municipal government had desperately planned to launch a coordinated media smear campaign to brand me as an unstable rogue civil servant. They wanted to destroy my reputation before I could expose their crimes. But you cannot run a local public relations smear campaign when federal armored vehicles and crime scene tape are dominating the front page of every major national newspaper in the country. The narrative flipped with absolutely devastating velocity. Instead of reading fabricated stories about my supposed mental breakdown, the citizens of the county woke up to broadcast footage of their untouchable billionaire developer Julian Pierce and his flashy son-in-law Trent being paraded into a federal courthouse in heavy steel handcuffs. By noon on Wednesday, the United States Attorney General officially unsealed the massive federal indictments. The scope of the charges was staggering. Julian and Trent were officially indicted on 47 separate federal counts. The charges included massive wire fraud, aggravated embezzlement, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and systemic racketeering. Julian Pierce, the man who treated the local government like his own personal piggy bank, was suddenly reduced to a high-profile federal inmate denied bail due to extreme flight risk. Trent, the arrogant man who had mocked my cheap clearance blazer at the public auction, was placed in a high-security holding cell. His frozen bank accounts and seized luxury assets meant he could not even afford a private defense attorney. He was facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. His pristine bespoke suits were permanently traded for standard-issue prison uniforms. But I knew that cutting the head off the snake did not immediately kill the venom. The corrupt politicians who actively enabled Julian were still desperately scrambling to survive the massive legal fallout. Mayor Sterling and his compromised city council organized an immediate emergency public hearing. Their political strategy was incredibly transparent. They intended to publicly denounce Julian, act completely shocked by his profound greed, and pretend they were the innocent, unwitting victims of a highly sophisticated deception. They officially requested my presence at the civic hearing, hoping to control the narrative and force me to stick to their fabricated script. They drastically underestimated the forensic auditor they had just invited into their house. Friday morning arrived with crisp, clear skies. I did not wear the cheap department store blazer I had worn to the county foreclosure auction 2 months ago. I dressed for absolute war. I put on a perfectly tailored, crisp navy blue suit. I gathered my digital tablets, printed forensic spreadsheets, and heavily encrypted flash drives. I walked up the wide marble steps of City Hall, carrying the undeniable proof of their systemic betrayal. The atmosphere inside the massive civic chamber was absolutely suffocating. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with nervous bureaucrats, terrified local investors, and aggressive investigative journalists holding large cameras. The heavy oak doors were guarded by armed bailiffs, and the air conditioning could barely keep up with the body heat of the anxious crowd. As I walked down the long center aisle toward the primary witness table, I noticed a familiar face sitting near the back exit. It was my sister, Elise. She was sitting in the very back row, looking incredibly small and utterly pathetic. Her expensive designer handbag rested awkwardly on her lap, but it could not hide the deep, dark circles under her bloodshot eyes. Trent's massive bank accounts were entirely frozen by the federal authorities. Julian's luxury real estate empire was actively being liquidated to pay government fines. Her entire illusion of high society had completely evaporated overnight, leaving her with nothing but crushing debt and massive public humiliation. Elise leaned forward in her wooden chair, trying desperately to make eye contact with me as I walked past. She wanted a silent nod of forgiveness. She wanted a subtle sign that I would protect her from the devastating social and financial fallout. I kept my eyes locked perfectly straight ahead. I did not smile, and I did not frown. I looked right through her as if she were just another empty piece of furniture. She had chosen Julian's hush money over her own blood, and now she was forced to live inside the empty reality she had purchased. Mayor Sterling banged his heavy wooden gavel, calling the crowded emergency session to order. He launched into a sickeningly rehearsed speech praising my bravery and loudly condemning the horrific actions of Julian Pierce. He was desperately laying the political groundwork to absorb my victory and take the public credit for uncovering the crime. I sat at the witness table and listened patiently until he finally yielded the floor and formally asked me to summarize my auditing findings for the public record. I stood up and approached the wooden podium. I adjusted the microphone. I did not raise my voice to shout over the murmuring crowd. I did not pound my fists on the wood or deliver a passionate, emotional monologue. Passion can be debated by lawyers. Emotion can be dismissed by politicians. Raw, verified data is absolutely bulletproof. I opened my thick forensic binder. For the next 2 solid hours, I executed a meticulous, flawless public autopsy of their entire corrupt municipal government. I laid out the exact chronological timeline of the systemic corruption. I did not just talk about the crimes of Julian Pierce. I projected massive, high-resolution financial spreadsheets onto the giant screens behind the city council panel. I showed the silent, crowded room exactly how the municipal oversight committees had deliberately looked the other way for 10 straight years. I highlighted the specific inflated zoning permits, the fake environmental soil reports, and the ghost contracting invoices the council members sitting right in front of me had personally approved to facilitate the massive embezzlement. Mayor Sterling tried to interrupt my presentation, claiming those specific documents were simply administrative errors made by lower-level clerks. He was sweating profusely, his perfectly tanned face turning a deep shade of crimson under the harsh fluorescent lights. That is the exact moment I deployed the absolute kill shot. I pulled up the highly classified tracking algorithms I had secretly installed during the neighborhood grid blackout. I showed the entire public chamber the exact digital footprint of Mayor Sterling actively attempting to log into the emergency slush fund just 2 days prior. I displayed the offshore routing numbers tied directly to his personal political re-election campaigns, proving he was actively attempting to use stolen taxpayer money to pay off a media crisis firm to destroy my reputation. The silence in the massive civic chamber was deafening. The only sound was the frantic clicking of camera shutters and investigative journalists typing every single word into their laptops. Mayor Sterling slumped heavily back into his large leather chair, his long political career completely dissolving in real time. I let the cold, hard numbers do the maximum damage. I proved beyond a shadow of a reasonable doubt that the entire city council was fully complicit in the theft of the retired teachers' pension funds. By 5 o'clock that exact same afternoon, the political pressure reached an absolute boiling point. Facing imminent federal indictments of their own Mayor Sterling and the entire corrupted municipal board were forced to officially tender their immediate resignations. The state government stepped in, executing emergency control over the city finances and terminating the compromised bureaucrats. Most importantly, the federal judge overseeing the massive racketeering case signed an expedited emergency release order. The $3.5 million I had recovered from the hidden biometric vault was officially and permanently restored directly to the county teachers' retirement pension fund. The retired educators, the hardworking colleagues my late father had stood alongside for 4 decades, finally received the financial security they had rightfully earned. My father was gone, but his legacy was finally honored. The men who forced him to work himself into an early grave were now locked inside concrete cells. I had successfully used cold, hard numbers to dismantle an untouchable empire built on massive ego, systemic theft, and toxic nepotism. Julian's billion-dollar legacy was permanently reduced to a cardboard box of federal evidence files, and Trent was staring down the barrel of a ruined life. I walked out of the municipal building that evening and took a deep breath of the cool coastal air. Justice had been served with absolute mathematical perfection. But the story of the abandoned bungalow I bought for $200 does not simply end in a courtroom or a city hall chamber. While watching the corrupt men go to federal prison offered profound spiritual satisfaction, the American legal system provides an entirely different kind of reward for uncovering massive financial crimes. The real satisfaction was not just the moral justice I had finally achieved against my ex-husband. The ultimate victory was the jaw-dropping financial payout that immediately followed. While watching corrupt men trade their expensive, tailored suits for federal prison uniforms provides a profound sense of spiritual satisfaction, the American legal and financial systems offer an entirely different mechanism for ultimate closure. Moral victories are deeply important for healing the soul, but moral victories do not pay the mortgage or fund a new life. Justice in this country is incredibly expensive, but it also heavily rewards those who possess the intellectual discipline to do the painstaking work of uncovering systemic corruption. Under the specific provisions of American tax law uncovering immense federal tax fraud and recovering stolen government assets entitles the verified whistleblower to a substantial percentage of the total financial recovery. The Internal Revenue Service operates a highly structured reward program designed specifically to incentivize individuals who risk their careers and their lives to expose billionaire criminals like Julian Pierce. Because my forensic audit was the direct catalyst for the successful federal tactical raid and the subsequent devastating indictments, I was officially granted the maximum allowable bounty. The federal government awarded me a 15% mandatory cut of the original $3.5 million I had recovered from the flooded biometric vault. But the financial compensation did not stop with the physical currency. Because my automated digital dossier also handed the authorities the exact decryption keys to Julian's sprawling offshore shell company network, the state was able to seize tens of millions in illicit international funds. I was legally awarded a proportional percentage of those liquidated overseas accounts as well. When the bureaucratic paperwork was finally completed and the strict federal holding period cleared, the government wired exactly $1.2 million directly into my personal checking account. Because the funds were officially classified as a whistleblower bounty, the entire sum was delivered completely tax-free. I sat at my modest kitchen table, staring at the computer screen, watching the long string of zeros permanently alter the trajectory of my entire life. I had spent years living on a tight civil servant budget, carefully measuring my grocery runs and clipping coupons. Now I possessed the kind of liquid capital that insulates a person from the leverage of powerful, arrogant men. The spectacular public spectacle of the city council resigning and the billionaire's monumental downfall utterly transformed my professional reputation in the financial sector. The exact same private auditing firm that had cowardly suspended my employment contract when the corrupt politicians initiated their media smear campaign came crawling back to me. The senior partners invited me to an expensive steakhouse lunch, practically begging me to return to their corporate ranks. They offered me a highly lucrative partner track promotion, complete with a sprawling corner office and a staggering six-figure retention bonus. They wanted to use my newfound fame to attract high-profile civic clients to their firm. I looked at the senior executives sitting across the white linen tablecloth, desperately trying to buy my loyalty after throwing me to the wolves. I politely declined their generous offer. I paid for my own black coffee, left the upscale restaurant, and officially filed the commercial paperwork to open my own independent forensic auditing agency. I built a firm dedicated exclusively to tracking down corporate fraud, dismantling untouchable monopolies, and protecting vulnerable pension funds. I was no longer a disposable employee working under the thumb of easily intimidated managers. I was my own absolute authority. But the ultimate poetic justice, the absolute perfect mathematical closing of the loop, happened exactly 6 months later. While I was busy building a highly successful independent agency, my ex-husband Trent was actively experiencing the brutal, crushing reality of the federal justice system. Because the government had immediately frozen all of his bank accounts and seized his investment portfolios, Trent was unable to afford the high-priced defense attorneys required to fight a federal racketeering charge. His personal assets were systematically liquidated by the state to pay his mounting legal fees and heavy civil restitution penalties. Everything he had purchased with Julian's stolen money was stripped away, leaving him absolutely destitute. The absolute crown jewel of his superficial empire was the custom-built 6,000-square-foot modern mansion he shared with Julian's daughter, Elise. It was a sprawling monument to his unearned ego, featuring infinity pools, imported Italian marble, and sweeping coastal views. Because Trent defaulted on the immense commercial mortgages, the luxury estate was formally seized by the bank and scheduled to be sold at a public foreclosure auction. It was the very same public auction process where he had mocked me just months prior. Trent assumed that some wealthy real estate investor would swoop in and purchase his dream home, allowing him to maintain some twisted sense of architectural prestige, even from behind bars. He severely underestimated how thoroughly an auditor can poison a financial well. Over the preceding 3 months, I had utilized the considerable resources of my newly formed independent agency to quietly and methodically purchase all of the toxic secondary debt obligations legally attached to his property. Using a series of anonymous blind trusts, I bought up the obscure mechanics liens, the unpaid municipal utility bills, and the massive commercial contracting debts Trent had accumulated while recklessly building the house. By strategically layering these overwhelming legal liabilities directly onto the property deed, I rendered the mansion legally untouchable to any rational outside buyer. Any traditional investor who purchased the home would immediately inherit millions of dollars in highly toxic, unresolvable debt. Because my own shell companies held that debt, I was essentially paying the money back to myself, making it a brilliant, cost-free maneuver for me, but a financial death trap for anyone else. I engineered an invisible force field around the property, ensuring that nobody in their right mind would ever place a bid. On a crisp Tuesday morning, exactly 6 months after my original purchase, I walked back into the county courthouse. I walked down the long center aisle of the same public auction room where this entire ordeal had begun. I did not sit in the back row this time. I walked directly to the very front row and took a seat right in the center. I wore a tailored navy blazer and carried a single numbered bidding paddle in my hand. The room was packed with eager real estate investors looking for lucrative foreclosure deals. The auctioneer stepped up to the wooden podium and announced the primary lot of the morning. He read the address of Trent's beloved, sprawling modern mansion. He asked the crowded room for an opening bid of $500,000. A heavy, dead silence fell over the chamber. Every single investor in the room had done their extensive research. They had seen the massive toxic liens I had intentionally wrapped around the property deed. They all knew the house was a complete financial disaster. Not a single person moved. Not a single paddle was raised into the air. The auctioneer looked around the quiet room, lowering his asking price. $400,000, he called out. Still, absolute silence. $200,000. Nothing. The wealthy investors stared at the floor, entirely unwilling to touch the cursed estate. According to the strict municipal bylaws governing foreclosure liquidations, if a property receives absolutely zero bids at the reserve price, the auctioneer is legally mandated to open the floor to any minimum nominal bid just to clear the municipal ledger. The auctioneer sighed heavily, adjusting his microphone. "We will open the floor to any minimum qualifying bid," he announced, his voice echoing across the large room. I slowly raised my numbered paddle high into the air. The auctioneer looked down at me, a confused expression crossing his tired face. "Yes, ma'am," he said, acknowledging my raised hand. "State your bid for the official public record." I looked at the auctioneer, remembering the exact sneer on Trent's face when he leaned over my row and told me I would always settle for garbage. I remembered the freezing nights sitting in the dark, abandoned bungalow, waiting for armed mercenaries to kick down my door. I remembered my late father working grueling double shifts to survive after his retirement was stolen. The complex mathematics of the universe had finally perfectly aligned. $200, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the absolute silence of the crowded room. The auctioneer scanned the room one final time, asking if there were any competing offers. The wealthy investors remained completely frozen, refusing to challenge the bid. "Going once," the auctioneer called out. "Going twice." He raised his heavy wooden mallet high into the air and brought it down with a resounding, echoing crack against the podium. "Sold to the bidder in the front row for exactly $200. The heavy gavel fell, sealing the absolute destruction of Trent's superficial legacy. I had taken the man who mocked me for buying a cheap property, and I had used the exact same system to legally steal his pristine, multi-million-dollar mansion for the exact same price. I lowered my paddle, stood up from my chair, and walked back up the center aisle toward the double doors. I stepped out into the bright California sunshine, feeling the warm ocean breeze against my face. For the first time in incredibly long years, I let out a genuine, deep breath, and I finally smiled. If you enjoyed this story of absolute mathematical vengeance, drop a comment below and tell me your favorite part of the trap. Hit that subscribe button for more real stories where the people who think they own the world find out the hard way that someone else is keeping the receipts. Until next time, keep your ledgers balanced and never, ever let anyone tell you to settle for garbage. The dust has finally settled on the county auction floor, and the heavy wooden gavel has struck the podium for the very last time. I hold the certified deed to a massive 6,000 square foot modern mansion that I purchased for a mere $200. But as I walk alone through the echoing empty marble hallways of the estate my ex-husband Trent used to call his kingdom, I do not just see a staggering financial victory. I see a profound and tragic failure in how we choose to raise human beings. When you strip away the dramatic federal raids, the hidden biometric vaults, and the offshore money laundering schemes, my story is not actually about real estate or complex forensic accounting. It is a story about the absolute bedrock of human character. It is a cautionary tale about parenting, values, family responsibility, and the devastating long-term consequences of how we guide our children through the complicated landscape of modern American culture. In American society, we often fall into a dangerous psychological trap. We frequently confuse the act of providing for our children with the act of actually raising them. We look at a man like the billionaire developer Julian Pierce, and society calls him a monumental success. He built a sprawling empire, he drove luxury vehicles, and he possessed enough liquid capital to buy municipal governments. He likely gave his own daughter everything that money could possibly buy. He probably paid for exclusive private schools, luxury vacations, and designer wardrobes. But what exactly did he build inside his own home? He built a family dynamic completely devoid of honesty, fairness, and emotional awareness. He raised a daughter who viewed her husband not as an equal partner, but as a disposable corporate accessory. Julian treated his own son-in-law as a human shield, a convenient scapegoat to be sacrificed the moment the financial pressure became too intense. He taught his family that loyalty is entirely transactional and that love is just another line item on a balance sheet. When you raise a child in a traditional family structure, but entirely remove the moral compass of basic human integrity, you do not create a strong adult. You create a beautifully dressed predator. Contrast that superficial existence with the foundation my late father provided for me. My father was a simple public high school history teacher. He did not possess a limitless black credit card. He could not afford to buy me a luxury vehicle when I turned 18 or send me on expensive European vacations. But my father gave me something infinitely more valuable than a trust fund. He gave me an unshakable understanding of absolute fairness, consequence, and extreme personal responsibility. He taught me that mathematics always balances, just like the universe eventually balances our moral actions. He demonstrated that true family values are not about projecting a flawless image of extreme wealth to the rest of the neighborhood. Traditional family responsibility is about teaching your child how to stand incredibly firm when the lights suddenly go out and the entire world demands that you compromise your soul. He instilled an emotional awareness in me that allowed me to look past the shiny veneer of arrogant men and see the terrified, hollow children hiding underneath. Parenting is an incredibly difficult, lifelong endeavor, especially in a culture that constantly shouts that your personal worth is dictated exclusively by your zip code and your bank account. Look at my own sister, Elise. She and I grew up at the exact same kitchen table. We ate the exact same meals, and we listened to the exact same lectures from our parents. Yet somewhere along the line, Elise chose to worship the blinding illusion of status over the quiet reality of loyalty. Parenting is not just about the words you say to your children before they go to sleep. It is about actively and continuously fighting the deafening cultural noise that tells them they are only as good as what they can purchase. It requires an active, daily cultivation of deep emotional intelligence. You have to teach a child how to recognize the profound difference between people who genuinely love them and people who merely want to use them. Elise never learned that crucial difference. She allowed the blinding allure of American materialism to completely overwrite her family loyalty. She chose the hush money of a corrupt billionaire over the safety of her own sister. Her tragic reality is a direct result of failing to anchor her identity in things that actually matter. Trent is perhaps the ultimate byproduct of a system that blindly praises relentless ambition while completely ignoring human integrity. Trent was raised to believe that cutting corners was simply smart business. He assumed that manipulating the system and stepping on the vulnerable were just the necessary steps to achieving the American dream. When families fail to instill a deep sense of empathetic responsibility, when they fail to teach a child that their daily actions create devastating ripples that affect real human lives, they release a profound danger into society. Trent thought he was an untouchable king, but he was truly just a hollow vessel. Because nobody ever taught him the value of honest, hard work, he was instantly crushed by the massive pressure of reality the moment his superficial safety net vanished. A true family structure is supposed to serve as a sanctuary of absolute honesty. It is supposed to be the one place on this earth where you are held accountable not by the harsh penalties of the law, but by the enduring power of unconditional love. When parents refuse to discipline their children out of a misguided desire to be their best friend, or when they shield them from the natural consequences of their own failures, they are actively setting those children up for a catastrophic collision with the real world. The real world does not care about your fragile ego. The real world does not care how much money your father makes. The real world will mercilessly lock you inside a biometric steel vault of your own making if you step blindly onto the pressure plate of your own massive arrogance. We must teach the next generation that true power does not come from intimidating the weak or stealing from the vulnerable. True power comes from knowing exactly who you are in the pitch-black dark and having the profound discipline to do the right thing even when nobody is actively watching. Before I leave you with a final thought about the legacies we leave behind, I want to invite you to become a permanent part of our growing community. If this journey resonated with your own experiences, if you deeply believe that true justice starts quietly at home, and that absolute personal accountability is the only way to build a meaningful life, I strongly encourage you to follow the channel Luke Vengeance. We share stories that dig aggressively past the superficial surface to expose the raw, undeniable truth hiding underneath. Hit that subscribe button as we continue to explore the profound consequences of the choices we make every single day. As I stand looking out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of this empty, foreclosed mansion, watching the sunset over the California coastline, I cannot help but think about the architectural blueprints of our lives. Every single day, we are pouring the concrete foundation for the next generation. We are setting the structural joists of their character. The absolute most terrifying question a parent can ask themselves is not whether their child will achieve immense financial success. The truly terrifying question is, what kind of ground you are building them on. Are you building your children on the solid, unshakable bedrock of honesty and fairness? Or are you building them on a highly pressurized, volatile water table of ego and entitlement, just waiting for a single fracture to wash their entire world away? The blueprints are entirely in your hands, but remember that the soil always reveals the truth in the end.